Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into something a little darker, a little heavier, so buckle in. We're headed back to the Middle Ages, that charming era of castles, plagues, pointy shoes, and let's be honest, deeply problematic ideas about women. Tonight's journey is titled Why Women Couldn't Say No to Sex in the Middle Ages, and yep, it's exactly as intense as it sounds. You're going to walk through the gates of the medieval world, lace up your mud-caked boots, and find yourself in a society where women weren't just expected to say yes. They were often legally, spiritually, and violently forbidden from saying no. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this, at least not with your sense of modern morality intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now tell me, what city are you listening from? And what time is it? I want to imagine you exactly where you are. Maybe under soft blankets, maybe next to a snoring cat, maybe with your earbuds barely hanging on. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you need to understand is this. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not a romantic endeavour. It was a legally binding contract, spiritually sanctioned, economically negotiated, and entirely slanted in favour of the man. You, if you were a woman in this world, didn't fall in love and choose your partner after a charming courtship. You were often betrothed as a child, with your father acting as chief negotiator, trading your future for land, titles, or strategic alliances. The church liked to call it holy matrimony, but honestly it was closer to holy transaction. Once that marriage was sealed, by vows, by witnesses, by sometimes disturbing public rituals, your body was no longer your own. Under the law of coverture, a woman was legally absorbed into her husband. You became part of him, like an appendage or livestock. And no, that's not exaggeration. In fact, English common law wouldn't even recognise a married woman's separate legal identity until centuries later. For now, let's just say you're not you anymore. You're his. And with that came the expectation that you, the wife, were always sexually available. Like, always. Consent? Not really a thing. Theologians and lawmakers spoke instead of the marital debt, meaning that spouses owed one another sex. But this was wildly asymmetrical. A man could withhold sex from his wife, say, if she annoyed him or embarrassed him, but a woman refusing her husband, that wasn't just impolite. It was considered a sin. So what if your husband was cruel? What if he smelled like an ox, drank too much, and grabbed you like you were a sack of barley? Too bad. The church taught that your husband was your path to salvation, and resisting him, even sexually, could put your soul in jeopardy. That's right. You might not only be beaten or scorned for saying no, you might be damned. That's a brutal choice to wake up to every morning, isn't it? And no, before you ask, this wasn't just among peasants in muddy villages. This applied from the bottom to the very top. Noble women, ladies, countesses, even the queens, were expected to bear this burden. In fact, for noble women, producing heirs was one of their main duties. No heir. That could mean annulment, exile, or worse. For these women, sex wasn't pleasure, or even intimacy. It was labour. Political labour, physical labour, and reproductive labour all rolled into one exhausting, compulsory act. Now, let's add a pinch of theology to this grim stew. The medieval church was obsessed with sex, like weirdly obsessed. It preached that sex was inherently sinful, but made one crucial exception: marriage. So within marriage, sex was allowed. As long as it was for reproduction, not fun. If a woman expressed enjoyment, that was suspicious. If she tried to refuse, that was worse. The church fathers were mostly men after all, and many of them had never been married. Their vision of womanhood was filtered through cloisters, scrolls, and a hearty dose of misogyny inherited from older Roman and biblical traditions. You get a sense of how twisted this logic became when you look at court cases from the time. There are records of women trying to report abuse, physical or sexual, only to be told that their suffering was essentially part of the deal. The church rarely intervened unless something was egregiously violent or scandalous. If a husband forced himself on his wife, that wasn't rape. It was just marriage. Medieval canon law didn't even define marital rape. In fact, that phrase wouldn't exist in legal texts for another 800 years. And then there's the fringe detail that might just make your jaw drop. In some parts of Europe, wedding rituals involved a literal public bedding. You heard that right. After the ceremony, guests would follow the couple to their chambers, tuck them into bed, and sometimes even stay to witness, or at least listen to, the consummation. Because nothing says blessed union like a room full of drunk relatives chanting for you to get it over with. So here's your first historical fact. Marriage in the Middle Ages was a religious and legal institution where consent was presumed, not required. Once married, a woman was expected to provide sex at any time, and refusal could be seen as sin, disobedience, or even grounds for punishment. Now here's your quirky fringe fact. In some regions, couples could be denied marriage rights if the man couldn't perform during a public test of virility. In one French case, a nobleman had to prove his stamina in front of clergy to keep his bride, because dignity was clearly optional in medieval France. And your scholarly debate? It's still ongoing over how much everyday medieval women internalised or resisted these norms. Some historians argue women had more influence behind closed doors than we give them credit for, using prayer, illness, or social cunning to avoid unwanted sex. Others insist the system was so rigid and violent that genuine refusal wasn't just rare, it was nearly impossible. Either way, tonight you're in a world where saying no wasn't just discouraged, it was erased. A woman could be a nun, a mother, a queen, but never unavailable. Her body was a vessel, a field, a transaction. Consent in the way we know it now was a fantasy, one that wouldn't begin to materialise for centuries. You don't remember when you first heard the word virgin, but in the Middle Ages, it's practically tattooed on your soul from birth. If you're born female, it's your most valuable asset, more prized than wit, strength or kindness. Virginity isn't just a personal zone, it's a currency, a symbol, a bargaining chip, and let's be honest, a bullseye. From the second you hit puberty, you're not so much a person as a potential vessel, untouched, unspoiled, and ready to be properly used. It starts early. You're 12, maybe 13, and the women in your household begin whispering about how you carry yourself, how your eyes shouldn't linger too long, how your skirts must cover your ankles, because boys notice. And the last thing you want is a boy to notice you. Because if something happens, even if it's against your will, the narrative flips fast. You're ruined. Damaged goods, not marriage material. You'd think the blame might fall on the man in such scenarios, but no. The virginity standard is a one-way street, and women do all the driving and all the crashing. Men don't have to be virgins. In fact, they're not expected to be. If a knight brags about his wenching, it might earn him laughs and a slap on the back. But if a woman is suspected of even entertaining a suitor without permission, she risks being cloistered, punished, or worse, branded a whore regardless of the facts. What's wild is how the value of virginity is tied directly to economics and property. You as a virgin represent a promise, a sealed garden, untouched, ripe for cultivation. It's brutal and poetic, which is kind of the whole vibe of the medieval mindset. Families, especially those in the upper classes, guard this dream promise with obsessive zeal. They lock daughters away, police their movements, and sometimes even perform physical checks. Yes, those kinds of checks. Hymen inspections were very much a thing. Never mind that the science was shaky at best. The culture believed what it wanted to believe. And if you're poor, the story doesn't get better. It just gets rougher. Peasant girls often worked alongside men in fields, mills, or markets, and that proximity came with risk. You might be too visible, too accessible. If something happened to you, if a lord or a travelling merchant or even your own employer forced himself on you, what mattered wasn't your trauma. It was whether or not you could still be married off afterward. Virginity wasn't just about you, it was about your family's survival, your dowry, your alliances, your respectability. Sometimes a girl might even be married off because she was raped. The logic, it restores her honour. So imagine this. You're assaulted, terrified, bleeding, humiliated, and your reward is marriage to your rapist. Because the act wasn't considered a violation of you, it was a violation of your father's property rights. If the man agrees to marry you, it fixes the problem. Problem solved, right? This is where you start to realise just how slippery the idea of consent was. It's not that people didn't know what rape was. The term raptus was widely used in law codes, and there were punishments on the books, but there was a huge caveat: the victim had to be a virgin, or at least perceived as one. If she wasn't, the court might argue that she led him on, or was used to such behaviour. And good luck proving your case, because your testimony was considered weaker than a man's. Your body was evidence, but only if it fit the right narrative. Now, let's get even darker. Some families didn't just protect their daughters, They commodified them. If you were beautiful, well-behaved, and came from a decent bloodline, you could be presented at court like a prized artifact. There were cases where young girls, 10, 11, sometimes younger, were paraded before powerful men. It wasn't considered predatory, it was strategic. If a king or noble showed interest, that was the family jackpot. Virginity could turn into a royal marriage or a powerful alliance. Everyone wins, except the girl, of course. The church played a major role in all this, championing virginity as the gold standard of holiness. Virgin saints were the rock stars of medieval spirituality. Think of Saint Agnes, martyred at 13 because she wouldn't give herself to a Roman soldier. Or Saint Cecilia, who supposedly convinced her husband never to touch her because an angel guarded her purity. These weren't just tales, they were blueprints. You were supposed to aspire to that level of sacrifice, be so virtuous that you'd rather die than be touched, but also somehow be ready to marry and serve a husband whenever required. It's a catch-22 soaked in incense and guilt, and if you couldn't live up to it, if you were raped, seduced, or simply curious and crossed the line, your options were limited. Convents became a dumping ground for girls whose reputations couldn't be salvaged. Sometimes this was spun as a spiritual calling, but everyone knew what it really was: damage control. Once inside, you might find a kind of safety, or another form of imprisonment. But more on that in a later chapter. Let's not forget the bizarre cultural contradictions. On one hand, virgins were revered, mystical, saintly, divine. On the other hand, their value was entirely tied to what hadn't been done to them, and once that purity was lost, you dropped like a stone in social worth. You could be the same girl with the same smile, the same voice, but you were no longer worthy of love, marriage, or even compassion. Here's your historical fact. Virginity was considered a legal and spiritual asset in medieval Europe, often required for marriage, sainthood, or social survival, and loss of it could end a woman's life prospects regardless of how it was lost. Your fringe fact: in some medieval Italian cities, fathers had to sign formal documents guaranteeing their daughter's virginity before a marriage contract could be finalised. If it turned out to be false, the entire marriage could be annulled and dowries lost. And your scholarly debate? Some historians argue that not all medieval societies were equally obsessed with virginity. In certain Nordic or Celtic traditions, premarital sex was tolerated or even expected before marriage negotiations. But the dominant Christian European narrative drowned those exceptions in its tidal wave of purity culture. So here you are, lying awake under that itchy wool blanket, knowing your entire future hinges on something you can't see or measure, and may not even have any control over. Virginity isn't your virtue, it's your leash. You're sitting in the stone-cold nave of a medieval cathedral listening to Latin echo off the walls, and wondering how something so beautiful can carry rules so terrifying. It's Sunday morning, and the priest's voice drones on, delivering a sermon that most of the congregation won't fully understand. But you catch the parts that matter, the ones that have been burned into your daily life. Things about obedience, duty, and especially the sacred bond of marriage. The part they never say out loud, but you've come to understand, is this: the church doesn't care much about your voice when it comes to saying yes or no. Canon law in the Middle Ages was supposedly revolutionary. It declared, quite explicitly, that marriage required mutual consent from both parties. That's right, both. That means you're not supposed to be forced, bought, or tricked into marrying someone. In theory, this should be a win, progressive even. You can imagine some poor medieval teenager hoping this will save her from being sent off to marry a toothless old man with a title and a fortress full of mildew. But here's where the loopholes start to yawn open like bottomless pits. Consent, in canon law, was this airy, theoretical thing. It had to be freely given, but it didn't have to be enthusiastic or even verbal. A nod would do, silence was acceptable. A gesture, maybe even coerced, was often interpreted as agreement. And if a priest or your family said you had consented, that was the end of the conversation. There were no lie detectors, no court of appeals, plus you couldn't really unconsent. Once that vow was exchanged, it was over, even if you were tricked, even if you were 12 and didn't understand what marriage meant. Once spoken, it was locked in place like a cathedral door bolted shut for winter. The church taught that marriage was indissoluble, only death or annulment could end it. And annulments, reserved mostly for the wealthy and well-connected. If you're a peasant girl or a merchant's daughter, too bad. Your consent, once extracted, became permanent. Now imagine being married off young, say at 14, to a man 2 or 3 times your age. Not uncommon, especially among the upper classes. You've never lived alone, never travelled more than a few miles from home, and now you're expected to move into his estate, manage his household, bear his children, and of course, submit to him sexually. And if you hesitate, well, there's the marital debt to be paid. More on that soon, but for now, let's linger in this moment where the church seems, on paper, to be progressive, but in practice turns your consent into a decorative flourish. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The people applying canon law were almost exclusively men. Priests, bishops, theologians, and scholars interpreted the rules, and they did it through a lens that saw women as morally weaker, sexually tempting, and spiritually dependent on male authority. So what happened when you refused a marriage? Sometimes you were shamed, sometimes imprisoned. Occasionally you were dragged before a bishop's court and told to reconsider for the good of your soul. There are documented cases of women who resisted arranged marriages being confined in convents until they gave in. Some brave ones never relented. Others broke under pressure. Either way, their consent was eventually obtained, often under duress, emotional blackmail, or outright threats. But here's a particularly absurd twist. Secret marriages were allowed. If 2 people exchanged vows privately, even without witnesses, the church often considered it binding. Why? Because God saw everything, and your word was your bond. So you might not be able to say no to an arranged marriage, but if you whispered "I do" to a lover behind the hayloft, suddenly you were married in the eyes of God. This gave some women a narrow, risky path to choose their own partner, but it also meant they could be trapped in clandestine unions with no legal protection and no exit. And while all this legal knotwork tied women tighter and tighter to the men around them, actual enforcement of these rules was wildly inconsistent. One bishop might be lenient, another cruel. In some towns, girls who resisted marriage were left alone. In others, their families might accuse them of witchcraft or heresy to shut them up. So much depended on geography, class, and luck. There was no consistent justice, only the rolling dice of feudal life. The scholar in you starts to ask, why even bother with the idea of consent at all if it was so often ignored or manipulated? Well, it gave the church a moral edge over older pagan customs, where marriages were often just tribal arrangements. It let them say, "See, we protect women," while quietly upholding the same patriarchal structure under a more spiritual name. It's consent theatre, a performance with no real audience. So here's your historical fact. Canon law in the Middle Ages required mutual consent for a marriage to be valid. But in practice, consent from women was often coerced, ignored, or symbolically extracted without agency. Your fringe fact? Some medieval women staged fake elopements with hired actors to escape arranged marriages. A noble woman in 13th century France did exactly this, convinced a priest to witness her private marriage to a local knight, only to reveal later it was a ploy to block a political engagement. It caused a scandal so big the bishop himself had to intervene. And your scholarly debate? Some argue that the church's requirement of consent planted the early seeds for modern marriage rights. Others insist it was just a thin theological veil that masked centuries of enforced submission. The truth probably lives somewhere in between, a system with good intentions slowly crushed by power, gender roles, and societal fear. So you lie there, eyes open in the candlelit dark, thinking about how something as sacred as a vow can turn into a trap. You could say no, but no one would hear you. Or worse, they'd hear you and decide it didn't matter. You're sitting at the edge of your narrow straw mattress, staring at your hands and wondering, how did this become your life? You've done everything right. You went from a girl carefully trained in obedience to a woman who said the vows, lit the candles, kept her head covered, and kept her mouth shut. And yet, here you are, waking up every morning next to someone who believes your body is part of his morning routine, like washing his face or pulling on boots. You're not a woman anymore. You're a wife. And that, in the Middle Ages, means something terrifyingly specific. Your right to say no has been erased. The moment you marry, everything changes. You go from person to possession. Your land, if you had any, now belongs to your husband. Your labour, cooking, spinning, and childbearing belongs to your husband. And your sexuality absolutely belongs to him. You don't get to decide when or how it's used. Under both religious and secular law, he has a right to your body. If he demands sex and you say no, you're the one out of line. There's a chilling phrase that echoes through medieval law and theology: the marital debt. It's the idea that both spouses owe each other conjugal relations, but let's be honest, it wasn't enforced equally. Sure, in theory a man could be punished for refusing his wife, but in practice the only time a man got in trouble for withholding sex was if it interfered with a wife's ability to bear heirs. Meanwhile, a woman who refused sex was seen as rebellious, unholy, and even demonic. Yes, demonic. Because resisting your husband's authority was likened, by some theologians, to resisting God's divine order. Cute. And what happens when you do resist? First, well, he might shame you, shout at you, threaten you. He might pull you out of bed by the arm, or worse. And here's the gut punch: none of that is illegal. Marital rape wasn't a crime because the concept didn't exist. You were already his. There was no line to cross, no boundary he could violate. The law, the church, your neighbours, none of them saw what was happening to you as wrong. In fact, they might see you as the problem. Maybe your friends even scold you. They remind you that St. Paul said women should submit to their husbands in everything. You're not just being a bad wife, you're risking your soul. And the whispers don't stop. Maybe your husband goes to the priest and complains. And what does the priest say? Go home and fulfill your duty. That's the kind of spiritual guidance you get. And no, your social class doesn't save you. If anything, noble women might have it worse. You might live in a stone manor instead of a wooden cottage. But the walls don't protect you from forced consummation, from expectations of heirs, from being little more than a reproductive vessel. Queens had to endure it too. Even royalty wasn't immune. If you were queen and you failed to produce a son, your whole country might turn on you. Call you cursed, a failure, maybe even an agent of the devil. And unlike the peasant woman, who might fake an illness to get a night's rest, a noble woman had no privacy at all. Court attendants watched your movements. Midwives whispered about your cycle. Your body was public property, especially your womb. Sex wasn't just expected, it was monitored. Now, maybe you wonder, what if you said no and kept saying no? What if you ran away? Some women did, and many were dragged back. Husbands had the legal right to retrieve their wives and enforce the marriage. And if you were poor and had nowhere to go, you either starved, entered a convent, or returned to the same nightmare. Convents, by the way, weren't always refuges. Some were, but many were places of isolation and punishment. If you were sent there against your will, you might be cut off from family, locked away, even forced into a marriage with Christ that didn't feel any more consensual than your earthly one. The point is, saying no wasn't just discouraged. It wasn't an option. The very structure of medieval society was built on the assumption that you wouldn't say no. You couldn't. Your duty, your faith, your survival, it was all tangled up in that one grim expectation. Now here's the historical fact for this section. Once a woman married in the Middle Ages, she legally ceased to exist as a separate person under the doctrine of coverture. Her husband had complete legal control over her property, her decisions, and her body, including the right to sex at his discretion. Your fringe fact. In some medieval court cases, women tried to argue that their husbands were impotent as a way to escape the marriage, because proving he couldn't have sex was one of the few accepted grounds for annulment. These trials sometimes included humiliating examinations in front of panels of male experts. Basically, a medieval sex tribunal. Delightful. And your scholarly debate? Historians still argue over how often women actually resisted. Some say the silence in the record suggests widespread compliance. Others suggest it's the silence of erasure, that women resisted all the time, but their stories were never recorded or were actively destroyed. After all, history has always had selective hearing when it comes to women's voices. So here you lie, maybe curled into a corner of your shared bed, pretending to be asleep, praying the creak of the floorboards means he's leaving, not approaching. You're not tired, you're not sick, you're not angry, you're just hollow. And still somehow you're expected to open your body and call it love. You wake to the sound of bells, long, slow tolls that seem to mock you. Morning again, another day to keep pretending that everything about your life is normal. But deep down, you know what the priest is going to preach this week. And you already feel your stomach twist. It's about wifely duty. Again. And not the kind that involves laundry or kneading bread. No, it's about submission. Specifically sexual submission. and why saying no to your husband is a one-way ticket to eternal damnation. And it's not just the priest. This is woven into the very sermons, confessional manuals, and moral guides that circulate across towns and kingdoms. The idea is simple. A wife who refuses sex sins against her husband and, more importantly, against God. And if that sounds harsh, that's because it's meant to be. Refusal isn't just a matter of personal preference in this world. It's framed as spiritual rebellion. The reasoning? Well, theologians, almost always celibate men with too much time and too many scrolls, love to wax poetic about the natural order of things. They believed men were rational, strong, and divinely appointed leaders. Women, emotional, weak, prone to sin, like Eve, remember? The one who got the whole species kicked out of paradise. Women were seen as spiritually inferior, and sex was part of the deal that tethered them back to obedience. If a man wanted it and a woman said no, she wasn't just withholding intimacy, she was disrupting the sacred hierarchy. And yes, it gets worse. Some theologians even taught that if a wife refused sex and her husband committed adultery as a result, she bore the greater sin. That's right. He strays because you said no, and somehow it's your fault. This logic was repeated in confessional handbooks given to priests, who then whispered it to wives kneeling with heads bowed, begging for moral guidance. You were told that your body belonged to your husband, just as his body belonged to you, but don't get any ideas. That was more a formality than an invitation to expect reciprocity. If he refused you, it was considered unfortunate. If you refused him, it was practically heresy. Maybe you've heard of St. Augustine. He's kind of the founding father of Western sexual guilt. He wrote that sexual pleasure, even inside marriage, was a temptation that needed control. The ideal wife, according to him, didn't enjoy sex, she tolerated it, because if you liked it too much, you were suspect. Lust was a sin, even inside the marital bed. So you're caught in a paradox. Say yes, but don't like it. Say no, and you sin. Enjoy it, and you sin. Refuse it, and you really sin. Fun game, right? So what do? You perform. You perform compliance, piety, even affection, because the alternative is social shame, or worse. Women who resisted too much were labelled contentious, disobedient, or even possessed. A man could complain to his priest that his wife was denying him, and the priest could, and often would, instruct her to comply, no matter her feelings. If the issue escalated, local bishops might get involved. Some towns even had officials whose job was to help resolve marital disputes, and let's be honest, those resolutions almost always came down on the husband's side. The idea that sex was your duty became so internalized that some women confessed in church for feeling relief when their husbands travelled. Others wept over their guilt for not wanting to be touched. It wasn't just physical submission, it was spiritual conditioning. And women were made to feel like they were the ones with the problem. If you flinched, if you dreaded the creak of the floorboard at night, you were told to pray for humility, not for help. And still, the church thought of itself as a protector of morality and purity. Irony alert. Some of the very men preaching this doctrine were deeply tangled in sexual hypocrisy. Monks kept concubines. Bishops had secret children. Priests told women to confess impure thoughts, then turned those confessions into the whispered fantasies. The lines between religious authority and personal desire got dangerously thin. Here's something even darker. Some texts encouraged husbands to discipline wives who denied them. That could mean verbal correction, or it could mean something more physical. And society let it happen. As long as a man didn't kill his wife, his authority over her body was seen as natural, even divinely endorsed. If a woman protested, her words were often dismissed as hysteria, irrationality, or the influence of the devil. So you adapt, you go quiet, you learn how to look away without seeming distant, you train your muscles to go limp so it's over faster. You tell yourself it's better than being accused of sin, and you start to hate the part of you that ever thought love could be something joyful or gentle. Because in this world, love is duty, and duty is submission. And yes, some women pushed back. There are rare scattered records of wives who defied their husbands. Some fled to convents, others took their grievances to church courts. But they were exceptions, not the rule. For everyone who resisted, hundreds didn't. Not because they lacked courage, but because resistance wasn't allowed. The walls weren't just around your home, they were around your entire world. So here's your historical fact. Medieval theology taught that marital sex was a woman's duty, and refusing it was considered a sin, sometimes even grounds for ecclesiastical punishment. Your fringe fact? One bizarre penance manual instructed women who resisted sex with their husbands to fast for days and recite prayers barefoot in the snow as punishment, because nothing fixes a broken heart like frostbite and starvation. And your scholarly debate? Some medieval scholars argue these rules were more symbolic than widely enforced, pointing to local variation and the private nature of many marriages. Others maintain the culture of guilt and control was so deeply embedded that enforcement wasn't even necessary. Women policed themselves out of fear, habit, and religious devotion. So now you lie in the dark, the fire low, your breath barely stirring. You think of the saints, the sermons, the sin. You wonder if God hears you at night when you say no silently in your head, while your lips stay still and your hands lie folded in forced surrender. You sit on the hard edge of the oak bench in the back of the church, listening again to words you've heard your entire life. This time they sound different, not softer but sharper. The priest is talking about the marital debt, that strange phrase you've come to loathe. To him, it's holy law. To you, it's a curse disguised in Latin. You shift uncomfortably, your back sore from work, your thoughts circling like storm clouds. You know what's waiting for you when you go home. You know what he'll expect. The debt is due. The concept of the marital debt is central to understanding why, in the Middle Ages, women couldn't say no to sex, even inside what was supposed to be the most sacred of unions. It's not a metaphor. It was real doctrine, rooted in church teaching, echoed in legal texts, and repeated in every pulpit from the Pyrenees to the North Sea. The idea was simple. By marrying, both spouses agreed to supply each other with sexual access. It wasn't about romance or desire, it was a duty, like taxes, like tithes, and if you failed to pay, you risked not just your husband's anger, but your soul's salvation. For men, this duty was conveniently flexible. He could claim fatigue, illness, spiritual retreat, even traveller's excuses. No one batted an eye. But you didn't get excuses. If you were tired, you were lazy. If you were ill, you were exaggerating. If you said no, you were a sinner. The assumption was that women didn't really have sexual needs. They were simply vessels for a man's urges and a divine reproductive plan. You were the field, he was the plough. That's not just metaphorical. Some sermons actually use that analogy. Subtlety wasn't exactly medieval theology's strong point. And what if you wanted sex during your pregnancy? Still expected. During your recovery from childbirth? Still expected. After a beating? Definitely expected. Your consent wasn't part of the equation anymore. Once you said I do, that was it. You'd made your bed and his, and now you were legally, spiritually and bodily obligated to lie in it. Sometimes the doctrine was so precise it bordered on parody. There were detailed debates among clergy about how often married couples should have sex. Once a week, only on certain days, never on Sundays or holy days. There were even lists. Yes, lists. Your sex life could be scheduled by churchmen who had never been married, never had sex, and never even spoken to a woman outside a confessional booth. These were the same men who thought childbirth was a punishment and menstruation was suspicious. And yet this idea of debt became foundational. Priests taught it. Husbands enforced it. Wives endured it. And every time you resisted, you could be reminded, gently or not, that your eternal soul was on the line. It wasn't framed as coercion. It was piety. Denying your husband was like denying God. It was selfish. It was dangerous. It was unnatural. Some women tried to delay the payment of this so-called debt by claiming religious fasting, or invoking days of abstinence prescribed by the church, Lent, Advent, the eve of feast days. But even these sacred loopholes could be denied if the husband insisted. After all, his soul was also on the line, the reasoning went. Better to give in than risk causing him to sin by seeking fulfillment elsewhere. You weren't just managing your own virtue, you were also responsible for his. This responsibility didn't stop at the bedroom door. The legal system backed it up. If your husband accused you of withholding sex, it could be grounds for annulment, or worse. In some areas, ecclesiastical courts actually punished women who refused the marital debt without just cause. And again, just cause was a slippery concept. It rarely included consent. Your reasons had to be physical, visible, or religious. Not emotional, not personal, not fear. And let's not forget how marriage itself was structured as a series of transactions. A dowry was exchanged. Land might be transferred. Alliances sealed. It was in many ways a business deal with a sexual clause. You weren't a bride, you were a contract with a pulse. And if that contract stopped fulfilling its duties, there were consequences. Social, spiritual, sometimes even violent. Even the very language of the time reveals how twisted it all was. Words like obedience, submission, and duty were laced through sermons, legal documents, and marriage vows. There was no partnership as we think of it today. Love might grow, sure, but it wasn't required. Sex, however, was. And if love didn't exist, if tenderness never came, the sex still had to happen, regularly, faithfully, in the dark, while you kept your eyes on the ceiling and your mouth closed. It's easy to ask, sitting centuries later, why women didn't rebel more often. But rebellion implies there was a path out. Most women had none. They were economically dependent, legally powerless, and spiritually gaslighted. Even if you wanted to resist, where would you go? Your father's home wouldn't take you back, the church would send you back, the courts would shame you, and the neighbours would whisper, always whisper, so you find your ways to survive. Some women feigned illness, others faked piety. A few went numb, folded themselves into something smaller and quieter. Some made peace with the system because there was no other choice. Because it was safer to lie still and think of angels than to speak up and risk everything. Here's your historical fact. The doctrine of the marital debt was a key tenet in medieval Christian teaching, framing sexual access within marriage as a mutual but asymmetrically enforced obligation that rendered female consent largely irrelevant. Your fringe fact. Some medieval handbooks instructed husbands to gently scold their wives for initial resistance, but if persuasion failed, to physically correct them, as one would a disobedient servant. This wasn't hidden. It was considered part of loving leadership, like a warm-hearted slap. And your scholarly debate? Modern historians argue over whether the concept of the marital debt was universally enforced or mostly rhetorical. Some say it was a lived reality for most women. Others believe it was a tool used selectively, invoked by men when convenient and ignored when inconvenient. Either way, you're left holding a spiritual invoice that never stops arriving. It doesn't matter if you're tired, afraid, or simply unwilling. You owe him. You always owe him. And God apparently is keeping score. You're standing in a high-ceilinged hall, light bleeding in through narrow stained glass windows, and your velvet skirts swish against the cold stone floor. You're a noble woman, educated just enough to read psalms and sign your name, dressed in rich fabrics you didn't choose, in a castle you didn't build, married to a man you barely know. You are titled, admired, and entirely owned. People assume you live a life of luxury, but under all the lace and embroidery, you're still a woman in the Middle Ages. Which means when it comes to sex, power, and consent, you don't have any more say than the peasant girl milking goats outside the gates. Because even noble women, cloaked in status and protocol, were expected to submit. In fact, they had more to lose if they didn't. You were the keeper of dynasties. Your womb was not yours, it belonged to your husband, your family line, and your realm. Producing legitimate heirs wasn't just a goal, it was your primary job. If you failed at it, you might be cast aside, locked in a tower, replaced with someone younger and more fertile. Or worse, accused of witchcraft, infidelity, or divine punishment. Marriage among the nobility was almost always arranged, sometimes before the couple was even born. Little girls were promised in writing, their names sealed in wax, their futures bartered over wine and parchment. Once you hit puberty, the countdown began. Your first period marked the start of your value. Not your intellect, not your voice, not your potential for leadership, but your ability to bleed and bear. So when your husband came to your chambers that first night, what you wanted didn't matter. All that mattered was proof. Blood on the sheets, witnesses to the consummation, and preferably a pregnancy within the year. There are stories, disturbing, well-documented stories, of noble women being inspected the morning after their wedding to confirm they'd done their duty. Maids would report back to family elders. Bedsheets were sometimes shown off as symbolic trophies. And this wasn't considered invasive. It was tradition. If there was no blood, questions were asked. If too much blood, even worse. Some girls were so young the act bordered on torture. But no one called it that. They called it marriage. And what about consent? Let's not pretend it existed. Your husband could come to you any time, day or night, drunk or sober. If he had political enemies, you might be used to forge alliances through children. If he had ambitions, he might force himself on you more often, just to ensure an heir. Your refusal could be taken as sabotage. There are accounts of queens and countesses beaten or publicly shamed for coldness. In some cases, they were sent away entirely, declared unfit to rule alongside their husbands. And if you tried to run, forget it. You'd be dragged back, or executed for desertion. Take Isabella of Angoulême, married at 12 to King John of England. She was whisked away from her homeland, separated from her family, and immediately expected to fulfill her royal role, physically and politically. She had no say, none, and though she later manoeuvred with cunning and influence in those early years, she was just another young bride with royal blood and no personal freedom. Or Margaret of Scotland, married off at 13 to the King of Norway. Her entire life was reduced to a political solution. She crossed the sea to wed a stranger. Her letters, if you can find them, hint at homesickness and isolation. She was expected to adapt, perform, reproduce, and she did, because not doing so would mean scandal, disgrace, maybe death. And still, noble women had to smile through it all. They were supposed to embody grace, patience, piety. The ideal lady was silent, modest, and sexually available, but not too available. That could look suspicious. If she enjoyed her husband's touch too much, people whispered. If she resisted, they whispered louder. Her body was not just her husband's. It was a symbol of family honour, national unity, divine favour. Every pregnancy was political, every miscarriage a crisis, and if she birthed daughters instead of sons, she bore the shame alone. In rare cases, a noble woman might outlive her husband and gain temporary autonomy. But even that came with strings. As a widow, you were expected to remarry, quickly, strategically, often to someone even worse. Because widows with wealth and land were dangerous. They were women with power. And power in this world had to be put back in male hands as soon as possible. Still, some noble women tried to push back. Eleanor of Aquitaine defied 2 kings and led armies, but even she was imprisoned for daring to act without male approval. Christine de Pizan wrote sharp critiques of misogyny in her manuscripts, arguing that women were more than childbearing machines, but those were exceptions. You're not Eleanor, you're not Christine, you're just another woman in a stiff bodice, praying for a pregnancy that might keep you safe, and for a husband who might not hurt you tonight. Here's your historical fact. Even high-ranking women in the Middle Ages had no legal right to refuse sex within marriage. Noble women were expected to produce heirs, and their consent was not required for conjugal relations. Your fringe fact? Some noble weddings included a bizarre ritual where guests would escort the bride and groom to the bedchamber and toss stockings or coins on the bed for good luck, before leaving them alone to seal the deal. Talk about pressure. And your scholarly debate? Historians still wrestle with the question of whether noble women wielded soft power through influence, patronage, and diplomacy, or if these rare moments of autonomy were exceptions that proved the rule of systemic female submission. Either way, none of it protected a woman from the basic fact that her body was a battlefield, her consent an afterthought. So you lie there in your canopied bed, laced into a gown you didn't choose, with a husband whose breath smells of wine and politics, and you understand no title, no jewels, no amount of courtly poetry will change the fact that when he wants you, you must be his. You wake before the sun, your hands already raw from the chill in the morning air, the ache of yesterday's labour still buried deep in your shoulders. You're a peasant woman, married at 16 to a man who smells of smoke and barley, and whose hands are as rough as the fields he tills. Life isn't romantic here. It's relentless. The mud never leaves your boots, the bread is always stale, and the demands never stop, not from your husband, not from your lord, and not from the sky that keeps refusing to rain. And in this hard world, the idea of saying no to anyone, least of all your husband or your feudal master, is laughable, dangerous even. Because being a peasant in the Middle Ages meant you were property on top of property. Your husband owned you in marriage, sure, but above him sat your landlord, your lord, and possibly a church authority or two. They all had say over your life in one way or another. Your work, your home, your children, your body. And if you were unlucky enough to live under a particularly powerful or predatory lord, your wedding ring wouldn't protect you from his gaze. In fact, it might draw it. Let's talk about the practice no one liked to name, but everyone understood. Droit du Seigneur, or the Lord's right. There's still debate among historians over whether it was formally codified or mostly mythical. But one thing's certain. The fear was real. The idea was that on your wedding night, your lord could demand sexual access to you before your husband. In some tellings, he had the first night, a literal legal right. In others, it was more of a veiled expectation, whispered but never written, enforced through threat rather than law. Did it happen? There are too many accounts scattered through village legends, court records and oral histories to pretend it never did. Whether or not it was law, it was culture, and culture, especially in feudal Europe, was often stronger than legislation. If your family relied on the lord's goodwill, if your crops depended on his land, if your husband worked his horses or served in his militia, you didn't say no, you couldn't, because saying no could mean eviction, famine, or worse. And even outside of this grim folklore, the daily reality for a peasant woman was one of near total vulnerability. Your husband might not be a bad man, maybe he works hard, maybe he doesn't hit you, maybe he even smiles once in a while, but he still expects sex, not occasionally, often, not gently, just enough to mark his right. And again, the law is on his side. Refusing him could lead to punishment, public or private, and if you ever dared to report abuse to a local official or priest, you'd likely be sent right back to him with a reminder of your duty. Work doesn't offer relief. In fact, it compounds everything. Peasant women didn't just stay in the home, they worked the fields, milked livestock, brewed ale, mended nets, sheared sheep. And these spaces, barns, stables, workshops, were often isolated, vulnerable. You're surrounded by men, farmhands, tanners, coopers, some of whom see you as fair game. There's no HR department, no neighbour with a phone to call. If something happens, it happens, and you carry it with you silently while cleaning clothes in the river. There are tales, horrible, half-forgotten tales, of women who tried to resist and were made examples. Stripped in the town square, shaved bald, marked. Some had their marriages annulled by the lords as a form of punishment. Others had their land seized, or were turned out of their homes entirely. Your safety wasn't a right. It was conditional, on silence, on submission, on staying in your place. And let's not forget the church's role here. Priests preached virtue and chastity, but rarely for men. For you, the sermons were about obedience, modesty, and accepting your lot. Some priests were kind, others weren't. In some villages, a priest might take advantage of his position, especially if he offered confession in private or visited homes under the guise of blessing. And you couldn't report him either. He was God's servant. Your word meant nothing against his. What's worse, if you became pregnant through coercion, by a lord, a priest, or anyone else, your husband was expected to raise the child as his own. There were no paternity tests, no justice systems designed to help you. It was easier to lie, to hide, or to disappear. And sometimes the child was taken away to serve in the lord's household anyway. Another layer of control wrapped in iron and cloth. Of course, not every man in the village was a predator. Some were tired, kind, even resigned to their own lack of control. But systems don't need everyone to be a villain. They just need enough of them, with enough silence to let it spread. And this system, it had centuries of momentum wrapped in stone walls, bloodlines, and holy verses. You were born into it, you bled into it. And no matter how hard you worked, you couldn't work your way out. Here's your historical fact. Feudal systems in the Middle Ages often positioned peasant women as doubly subordinated, first to their husbands and then to their lords, leaving them vulnerable to both domestic and institutionalized coercion. Your fringe fact? In some parts of Europe, it was customary for lords to offer wedding gifts to new brides, which sounds sweet until you realize it was often a gesture masking power, reminding the couple who really owned their future. And your scholarly debate? The legitimacy of droit du seigneur remains hotly contested. Some historians argue it was more myth than practice, a reflection of peasant fears and folklore. Others argue that, formal or not, lords exercised sexual control in ways that felt just as real and just as terrifying as any law. So here you are, a small figure against a vast sky, staring at the field stretching to the horizon. You harvest wheat with calloused hands, knowing there's no sanctuary in daylight and no safety when the sun goes down. Your no was never going to be heard. So you swallow it. Again. You sit in the confessional, behind a wooden screen that's supposed to offer privacy but not comfort. The priest's voice on the other side is calm, dry, maybe even a little bored. He's heard it all before, or at least he thinks he has. Your hands tremble in your lap. You don't know how to say the thing you came here to say, not because it's unspeakable, but because you already know it won't be heard. You hesitate, you whisper. My husband forces himself on me. There's a pause, a silence so thick it wraps around your chest. Then he exhales, as though you just confessed to not fasting properly. Go home, he says, and be a better wife. This is what passes for justice in the Middle Ages when it comes to a woman's body. You can't say no, not to your husband, and not to the priest. And even if you try, they don't hear you, or they pretend not to, because the church, in all its power and splendour, has chosen silence when it comes to marital rape. Not passive ignorance, but active silence. A deep, centuries-long decision to simply not address it, to let it fester in the shadows while preaching love and virtue from the pulpit. Canon law, the great fortress of medieval religious doctrine, is strangely quiet on the matter of marital violence. There are endless pages on fasting, on the sinfulness of lust, on when and how you can have sex in marriage, spoiler, never on feast days, but almost nothing about what to do if a woman is hurt by her husband's hands, or worse. The silence speaks volumes. It tells you your pain doesn't count, that your suffering is just part of the marital debt, that what's happening to you isn't wrong, it's expected. Confessors, priests assigned to hear sins and grant absolution, used manuals to guide them through penances. These manuals were detailed, specific, and widely circulated. They had sections for nearly every kind of offence: lying, stealing, impure thoughts, even sneezing during the Eucharist. But if you search for any mention of forced sex in marriage, you'll find nothing. Or worse, you'll find implicit endorsements. Wives who denied their husbands were the ones told to repent. Husbands who beat their wives for resisting weren't even mentioned. So what do you do when the people who claim to guard your soul can't be trusted to protect your body? You go quiet. You tell yourself it's your fault. You confess for being a bad wife, for not trying harder, for being angry. You sit on cold wooden pews and listen to sermons about the sanctity of marriage, all while carrying bruises under your sleeves. And you begin to understand the church doesn't want your truth. It wants your obedience. And even if you try to seek help beyond confession, what are your options? You could petition an ecclesiastical court. You could accuse your husband, assuming you're literate, brave, and have enough money or influence to make it that far. But most women weren't. Most had no legal training, no allies, and certainly no precedent for having their marital trauma taken seriously. When court cases involving domestic abuse did happen, they were often framed around property damage, public scandal, or failure to perform duties, not consent. There are rare exceptions. In 14th century England, a few women managed to win ecclesiastical separation from their husbands on the grounds of cruelty. But even then, they weren't truly free. Divorce didn't exist, not as we understand it. You might be allowed to live apart, but you couldn't remarry. You were still technically married in the eyes of God, which meant you still owed your husband sexual access if he ever came calling again. Separation was a legal fiction, and it wasn't designed to protect you. It was designed to preserve the institution of marriage. The Church's silence wasn't just about marriage. It extended to the very nature of female suffering. Many clerics believed that suffering was good for women, that it purified them, that enduring pain made them holier, closer to the Virgin Mary. Some saints were canonized not for their joy, but for their agony. St. Christina the Astonishing supposedly threw herself into a furnace and leapt into freezing rivers to mortify her flesh. This was seen as virtuous. So is it any wonder that when you suffer at home, in your bed under your husband, the Church says, offer it up to God? Even worse, some theologians claimed that a woman could not be raped by her husband because in marriage her consent was perpetual. You'd already given yourself to him, body and soul. Anything he did afterward was within his rights. This isn't just ignorance, it's deliberate moral blindness, and it didn't fade with time. Centuries later, this belief still echoed through legal systems, religious teachings, and popular culture. But here, in this cold wooden confessional, you feel its full weight pressing on your chest. Here's your historical fact. In the Middle Ages, the Church did not recognize the possibility of marital rape, and most theological or legal texts assumed that a husband had the right to sex within marriage, regardless of his wife's consent. Your fringe fact. Some penitential handbooks even instructed confessors to ask women whether they were enjoying sex with their husbands too much, not whether they were being hurt or coerced. Joy was more suspect than violence. Let that sink in. And your scholarly debate? There's growing tension among medieval historians about whether this silence was a conscious choice or an accidental byproduct of patriarchal theology. Some argue that the Church deliberately avoided codifying protections for women because it would challenge male authority. Others claim the absence was more structural, simply a failure of imagination, empathy, or perspective. But either way, the result was the same. A woman who cried out in pain heard nothing back but echoes. So now you kneel in the pew, your head bowed not in prayer, but in resignation. You light a candle, because it's what you were taught to do. But there's no comfort in the flame, just a flicker of anger. Or maybe it's still hope. Quiet, unwanted, and fading fast. You're sitting in the corner of the scriptorium, squinting at the tiny Latin letters inked into worn parchment, flipping through the lives of the saints, the virtuous women the Church has chosen to immortalize. The pages are full of golden halos and brave martyrdoms, of vows and visions and purity preserved at all costs. But the more you read, the more your stomach turns. Because under all the sanctity and celestial poetry, these stories aren't about triumph, they're about coercion, pain, terror, and an ideal of womanhood that only makes sense if your body doesn't belong to you. The stories begin to blur. A noble woman refuses a suitor, so he tries to drag her into marriage by force. She flees, hides, prays, and eventually dies rather than submit. She's canonized. Another woman pledges herself to God at a young age, but her father marries her off anyway. She resists, gets locked in a tower, and is celebrated for keeping her chastity intact, until she's beaten to death. Another escapes into the wilderness to avoid a prince's advances, lives on nothing but roots and rainwater, and is praised for choosing starvation over sex. These are your holy role models. Take St. Agnes. Just 13 when she was condemned for refusing to marry a pagan noble. When she wouldn't give up her virginity, she was stripped and dragged naked through the streets, and thrown into a brothel. The texts say angels protected her from harm, and that no man could touch her. But you know better. Even if the miracle spared her body, the trauma didn't vanish. And still, the story is told like a triumph, a young girl's spiritual strength. Not a violent assault, not a horror story, or Saint Dymphna, the daughter of a widowed king who after losing his wife decided his daughter looked enough like her to marry. She fled with her confessor, hid in a remote town, and when her father eventually found her and she refused him, he beheaded her. She's now the patron saint of mental illness. Because of course she is. These women are lifted up as symbols of divine resistance, but only because they suffered. Their victories are measured not in autonomy or safety, but in how long they could endure torment before death or divine rescue. They didn't win by escaping, they won by surviving just long enough to die for the right reasons. There is no story of a woman who said no, walked away, and lived peacefully. That's not part of the medieval imagination. Even the saints who weren't killed are praised not for the lives they chose, but for the bodies they refused to give. Virginity wasn't just a virtue, it was a weapon. The only thing more powerful than a pure woman was a pure woman who suffered. The more brutal the trial, the holier the woman. And don't even think about consent. That concept is alien here. The goal isn't for these women to own their choices, it's to have their choices sanctified after being stripped from them. You start to notice the patterns. In almost every story, the woman's value comes from what she withholds. Her body, her desire, her voice. She becomes pure by subtracting parts of herself. The ones who survive, they're the ones who surrender to convents or cloisters, choosing spiritual marriage to Christ. Not because it offers peace, but because it's the only space where they can say no to men and not be punished for it. Even then, it's not freedom, it's a trade. They get divine protection in exchange for lifelong. You think about the girls who grew up hearing these stories, who were told these were the women to aspire to. What message did they carry in their bones? That a woman's only power lies in saying no until someone kills her for it? That suffering is salvation? That the only safe way to refuse sex is to die or become a nun or both? And of course this narrative wasn't limited to sacred texts. These stories bled into culture, into songs, plays, stained glass and embroidery. A tapestry in a noble's hall might show St. Margaret bursting from the belly of a dragon, sword in hand, her chastity intact. A minstrel might sing of a lady who cast herself into a river to avoid dishonour, and everyone in the room would nod, misty-eyed as if this was beautiful. But you see what's really there. A world that has turned female suffering into entertainment, and female sadness into sainthood. It's not just about religion. These stories were social instruction. They were how women learned what happened when you said no. If you resisted, you might be beaten, exiled, or martyred. But if you survived without giving in, you might become a saint. Not exactly a happy ending, but the best available. And let's not ignore the male saints. When they resist temptation, they're celebrated for spiritual discipline. But they're never paraded naked through streets. No one throws them into brothels to test their purity. The trials of male saints are often intellectual, theological, even heroic. They fight dragons, they challenge emperors, they preach in hostile lands. But women? Their dragons are suitors. Their enemies are fathers and husbands. Their battlegrounds are their own bodies. Here's your historical fact. Medieval hagiographies, the biographies of saints, often centered female sanctity around chastity and sexual resistance, portraying victimized women as holy for enduring abuse rather than escaping or preventing it. Your fringe fact. Some miracle stories involved women whose virginity was supposedly restored after being raped. Heaven fixing what men had broken so the saints could still qualify for holiness. Let that sink in. Even miracles bowed to purity culture. And your scholarly debate? Scholars continue to wrestle with whether these saint stories empowered women by offering them spiritual agency or reinforced patriarchal control by glorifying female suffering. It's possible, as many now argue, that both are true. The stories provided psychological tools for survival, but also trapped women in a cycle of martyrdom and silence. So you close the book, your fingers stiff from turning fragile pages, and you sit there in the quiet scriptorium trying to unsee what you've just read. You wonder how many girls died thinking their only worth was their no. How many women walked into fire, not because they were fearless, but because it was the only way out. You're walking down a crooked village lane, skirts brushing against the damp stone, and you catch the flicker of a symbol carved into the lintel of a nearby house. A jagged spiral, etched in haste, almost hidden beneath the moss. Your heart stutters. You've seen it before. It's a mark, not of ownership or pride, but of suspicion, maybe even accusation. The woman who lives there? She's been called unnatural, wicked, possibly a witch. You pass quickly, eyes lowered, but the chill follows you because you know how easy it is to go from wife to witch when you say no too many times. Witchcraft in the Middle Ages wasn't just a fringe obsession or a village rumour. It became slowly and then all at once a way for society to express its deepest fears about female autonomy, especially sexual autonomy. And while the great witch hunts would peak in the early modern period, the groundwork was laid centuries earlier. It began with whispers, with suspicion, with a woman who didn't marry when expected, or who refused her husband, or who knew too much about herbs and cycles and blood. And here's the terrifying logic. If you were a woman who resisted the marital role, especially its sexual demands, there had to be something wrong with you. No good woman denied her husband, no pure woman chose celibacy over obedience. So if you didn't submit, then maybe you weren't holy. Maybe you weren't natural, maybe you weren't even entirely human. The church helped feed this idea, fusing theology with folklore, until the image of the sexually defiant woman merged with the image of the sorceress. Books like the Canon Episcopi whispered warnings about women who flew at night with demons. Later texts would elaborate. Witches could seduce men, cause impotence, miscarriages, or even steal men's virility and keep it in jars. What began as superstition hardened into doctrine, and the woman who didn't want to sleep with her husband might suddenly be suspected of causing his sins. His lust, her fault, his failure, her spell. Of course, most accused witches weren't casting spells, they were just inconvenient. Midwives who knew how to help a woman avoid pregnancy, widows who refused to remarry, wives who talked back, healers who gave women teas that soothed their nerves or slowed their cycles. In a world where controlling female bodies was paramount, women with knowledge, independence or resistance were threats, and threats had to be neutralized. You might be called to a local inquiry, accused by a neighbor you scorned or a husband you defied, and you wouldn't be judged by evidence. You'd be judged by your reputation, your eyes, your temper. Were you too quiet? Suspicious? Too loud? Dangerous? If you'd ever denied your husband or helped another woman do the same, that was practically a confession. And once you were accused, good luck clearing your name. Trials were grim theatre. You'd be asked impossible questions, pressed to name accomplices, forced to confess under duress, emotional, physical, spiritual. Torture wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Sleep deprivation, needles, swimming the accused, binding a woman's arms and legs and throwing her into water to see if she floated. If she did, she was a witch. If she sank, she was innocent. Of course, either way you drowned. And what was often at the heart of these accusations? Sex. The imagined perverse sex between women and devils. The fear that you, in resisting your husband, were aligning with some dark alternative. That your no wasn't just rebellion, it was diabolic. Even educated men believed it. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas, and later the infamous authors of the Malleus Maleficarum, claimed that women were more likely to become witches because they were inherently weaker, morally, intellectually, and sexually. They argued that women's lust made them easy targets for demonic corruption, that women used sex as power, and that power was unnatural. The only safe woman was the obedient one, the silent one, the one who said yes without complaint. This made female sexuality a battlefield, and your body a potential crime scene. You were watched, weighed, and judged. If you were too fertile, you were tempting. If you were barren, you were cursed. If you bled too much, too little, or not at all, people started whispering. And if you chose not to marry or to abstain within marriage, you weren't just making a personal decision, you were defying the entire cosmic order, and the punishment could be severe. Some women did lean into the suspicion, playing with fire, because they had no other weapons. They wore red when others wore grey. They grew herbs in secret gardens. They told stories under the moon and gave advice to other women about how to stay safe, how to hide from their husbands, how to fake illness, how to resist quietly. But it was a dangerous game. One false move, one wrong enemy, and you could find yourself tied to a stake, flames licking your ankles, your last word a whisper. No one believed. Here's your historical fact. The association between female sexuality and witchcraft took hold during the later Middle Ages, rooted in church doctrine that framed women's bodies as spiritually and morally suspect, especially those who resisted male authority. Your fringe fact? Some trial records describe witches who confessed under torture to stealing men's genitals and keeping them in nests or boxes. Absurd, yes, but these accusations reveal the deep male fear of losing sexual power to women they couldn't control. And your scholarly debate? There's division among historians about whether the church's witchcraft obsession was primarily about suppressing female sexuality or about broader social control. Some see it as a tool to reinforce marriage norms. Others view it as part of a wider panic over shifting power structures and gender roles. So now you walk faster past the marked house, heart racing not because you believe in witches, but because you know what happens to women who don't play their part. In a world that already sees your no as dangerous, being called a witch is just a final excuse to silence you, for good. You slide the heavy door closed behind you, the iron bolt grinding into place with a reluctant scrape. It's quiet inside, quiet in a way that feels strange after the constant chaos of married life. For the first time in years, no one is shouting your name, grabbing your arm, telling you what's owed. You lean against the stone wall, exhale, and take in the chill of the convent corridor. The air smells like wax, old wood, and something faintly medicinal. You've done it. You've left him, or maybe he died, or maybe you begged your brother or a bishop for mercy. Whatever it took, you're here now. You've made it to the only place where women might be allowed to say no. Medieval convents weren't safe havens in the modern sense. They weren't utopias of female empowerment. But they were among the very few places a woman could escape the relentless demands of sexual obedience. And so for centuries they became sanctuaries, not just for the devout, but for the desperate, the cast-off, the too clever, the too loud, the too unwilling. You find yourself among them now, nuns in wool habits, quietly moving between prayer and labour. Some are here because they wanted to be, some are here because they had nowhere else to go, and some are here because, like you, they needed to stop being touched. The church often described nunneries as brides of Christ, an image that sounds poetic until you realise it was also used to funnel women into yet another form of sexual containment, this time spiritualised. You weren't free in the convent, you were married to a divine figure you couldn't see, who made no demands except for total submission. The language didn't change, just the setting. You were still a bride, still expected to give up your body, but instead of children you produced prayer. Instead of silence enforced by beatings, You were trained to keep silent through discipline and fasting. And yet something here is different. No man climbs into your bed at night. No one reminds you of a marital debt. You wake when the bell rings, not when a husband shakes you. And in that space, however narrow, some women found a kind of peace, or power, or both. Monasteries varied wildly across Europe depending on region, wealth, and leadership. Some were strict and austere, cold stone cells, punishing schedules, constant hunger. Others, especially those attached to noble families or generous patrons, were surprisingly comfortable. Women here might have access to books, to gardens, even to music. Some learned to write, to illuminate manuscripts, to manage estates. Abbesses could hold immense influence, political, spiritual, even economic. In rare cases, they outranked male clerics. Within these walls, some women lived fuller lives than they ever could have in marriage. But this wasn't the norm, and it wasn't always safe, because even here the walls couldn't keep out everything. Priests still visited, confessors still wielded power, bishops still dictated rules from afar, and some nuns, especially the younger ones, were vulnerable to exploitation. There are records, disturbing, sparse but real, of sexual abuse within monasteries, of confessors who violated vows and bodies, of young women who were silenced, shamed or exiled after speaking up. Some convents operated more like prisons than sanctuaries. Girls were sent here against their will, their hair shorn, their names changed. Wealthy families used monasteries as storage for surplus daughters, especially those who failed to marry well or showed too much will of their own. If you were stubborn, clever, or loud, a convent could become your cage. You'd be told it was God's will. You'd be instructed to embrace humility. But behind the curtain of spiritual devotion, you'd know the truth. Someone decided your voice was too inconvenient to remain outside. And yet, within this paradox, safety wrapped in control, women carved out lives. Some nuns kept secret diaries. Some exchanged letters with scholars or lovers. Some taught other women to read, to think, to dream. The convent became a paradoxical place, both a silencer and a shelter. A space of submission, but also resistance. Take Hildegard of Bingen, for example. She was a 12th century abbess who wrote music, theological texts, and visionary poems. She corresponded with emperors and popes. She challenged church doctrine. Her writings are celebrated now, but in her time, she had to wrap her rebellion in divine visions. Claiming her knowledge came from God was the only way men would listen. And they did. Kind of. Or consider Herad of Landsberg, who compiled an encyclopedic work called Hortus Deliciarum, a garden of delights, meant to teach her fellow nuns theology, philosophy, and science. Her manuscript was richly illustrated and intellectually daring. And yes, it had to be cloaked in orthodoxy, but underneath it pulsed with autonomy. These were exceptions. Most nuns didn't change the world, most simply survived. They kept bees, they prayed, they endured, but even that mattered, because every hour not spent under the weight of a husband's demands was an hour reclaimed. Every moment a woman chose her own rhythm, however limited, was a soft rebellion. Of course, not every woman wanted to stay. Some fled the convents, climbing out of the windows in the dead of night to return to lovers, or even to the risk of normal life. Some got caught and were dragged back, forced to kneel in front of abbesses, shaved again, punished. Others succeeded. Their stories are harder to trace. They weren't canonized, they weren't remembered, but they mattered too. Here's your historical fact. Medieval convents often served as places of refuge for women seeking to escape marriage, sexual violence, or societal expectations, but they were also spaces of strict control, spiritual pressure, and limited freedom. Your fringe fact. In some wealthier monasteries, nuns brewed beer, managed large agricultural estates, and oversaw schools for girls. Some even owned pets. Cats and birds appear in monastic inventories. So yes, medieval nuns had cats. That's a bright spot. And your scholarly debate? Historians continue to argue whether convents empowered women or simply relocated patriarchal control under the guise of holiness. Some point to abbesses who wielded real power. Others note how thoroughly nuns' lives were monitored, regulated, and defined by male clerical authorities. So here you are, kneeling in a cold chapel, your hands folded, your eyes closed. Not because you're praying, but because this is the only place where closing your eyes isn't dangerous. The only place where your body, at least for tonight, is finally your own. You step cautiously into the dimly lit hall of the ecclesiastical court. the thick scent of ink and candle smoke hanging in the air like a warning. The wooden benches are hard, the stone walls damp with the weight of centuries, and the men sitting behind the elevated bench don't look like judges. They look like priests, because they are priests. This isn't a place where justice wears a blindfold, it wears a cassock, and you're here not as a citizen seeking justice, but as a woman daring to ask if your pain counts. In theory, the church claimed authority over matters of marriage, sexuality and morality. If your husband beat you, refused you food, or disappeared with another woman, this is where you were told to come. But if what you needed was protection from rape, especially rape inside marriage, this court didn't want to hear it. Not really. It might listen to complaints about cruelty, about abandonment, even impotence if that was preventing procreation. But your consent? That was a theological abstraction, not a legal concern. You open your mouth to speak. Maybe you explain that your husband hurts you, that he forces himself on you, that you've tried to fulfill your duties, that you're afraid to sleep. The clerics glance at each other. They frown, not in sympathy, but in puzzlement. To them, you're not describing something wrong, you're describing something ordinary. Marriage, as they understand it, is inherently unequal. A woman's body belongs to her husband. What's happening to you is unfortunate, but not unlawful, not sinful, not something this court exists to punish. If anything, the tables might turn. They could question whether you are refusing your husband too often, whether you are guilty of withholding the marital debt, whether your resistance is actually the source of the problem. One well-worded accusation from him, and suddenly you're the defendant in your own case. This is the cruel irony of medieval ecclesiastical courts. They were the only institutions where women could bring certain complaints about annulments, inheritances, adultery, and yet the system was fundamentally rigged against them. These courts were run by celibate men who had never experienced marriage and had no intention of examining its darkest corners. Their doctrines were based on ideals, not lived reality, and when women stepped into their chambers, those ideals collapsed into judgment. Let's say you want an annulment. You'll need to prove that the marriage was invalid from the start. That might mean your husband was impotent. Yes, you might be forced to describe his body in humiliating detail, or that you were coerced into marriage. But remember, coerced doesn't mean scared or pressured. It means violently and provably forced, preferably in front of witnesses. If you said the vows, even through tears, that's considered consent. If your husband dragged you to the altar, but you nodded at the right moment, you're trapped. Forever. Or maybe you're a widow, fighting to reclaim your dowry from your husband's greedy brother. Maybe he says you were a bad wife, that you didn't fulfill your duties, that you weren't chaste. Now your sexual history is under investigation. Maybe a local priest testifies that he saw you too friendly with a neighbour. Suddenly you're not a grieving widow, you're a suspect. The court might rule against you not because of the facts, but because of your reputation. There were women who won cases in these courts. Women who fought for their rights and won back land, dowries and even annulments. But they were the exception. Most women lacked the education to represent themselves, the money to pay for legal support, or the social standing to be believed. And the deeper the case dug into issues of consent and abuse, the more likely it was to be buried under theological platitudes. Because to acknowledge the reality of marital rape would mean admitting that marriage wasn't always holy, that the sacrament could become a sentence, and that men, especially Christian men, might be sinning under the guise of law. The church was not ready for that reckoning, so it looked away. Sometimes justice came down to personality. A compassionate priest might take your side, counsel your husband, urge restraint. A harsh one might scold you for being cold, order you to resume your duties, or remind you that suffering is part of marriage. Even those who meant well often fell back on the same tired script: offer your pain to God, endure as Christ endured. And the punishments? If a man was found guilty of abuse, he might be fined, ordered to do penance, or temporarily separated from his wife, but no jail, no branding, nothing permanent. If you were found guilty of disobedience, public penance, a ritual humiliation, kneeling at the church doors with a candle in hand, begging forgiveness for failing your husband. The audience wasn't just your neighbours, it was your children, your in-laws, your priest, everyone who now knew what kind of woman you were. And let's not forget the hierarchy. If your husband had ties to the clergy, or your family was poor, or you had a reputation for speaking out, your odds of being taken seriously plummeted. Women of lower classes had fewer options and less credibility. Their pain didn't fit into the official framework. It was messy, inconvenient, easier to ignore. Here's your historical fact. Ecclesiastical courts in the Middle Ages had jurisdiction over marriage and morality, but rarely addressed, acknowledged, or punished sexual violence within marriage, focusing instead on issues like adultery, dowries, and annulment conditions. Your fringe fact? In some cases, a woman seeking annulment had to prove her husband's impotence by having him examined, sometimes publicly, by a panel of male experts who might test his ability to perform with his wife present. That's not justice, that's humiliation dressed up as theology. And your scholarly debate? Some historians argue that ecclesiastical courts offered more legal avenues for women than secular courts, which largely excluded them. Others counter that these venues only reinforced patriarchal norms under a cloak of religious authority, offering a facade of justice without its substance. So you leave the courtroom, shoulders hunched, eyes down, no closer to freedom than when you entered. Your testimony is now parchment, sealed with a wax filed under domestic matters. And your suffering? It lingers in the echoes of a place that hears everything except the word no. You're barefoot in the courtyard, the morning frost biting into the soles of your feet as a crowd begins to gather. Their eyes are curious but not kind. A priest stands nearby with a solemn expression, and beside him a pit of embers glows faintly, waiting. You were brought here not because of what happened to you, but because you said something. Because you insisted that it wasn't your fault, that he didn't have your consent, that what he did wasn't right. And now you're about to prove it. Not with words, not with evidence, not with witnesses, with fire, with pain. This is the medieval idea of trial by ordeal. You've heard the phrase before. It floats through village stories like a half-remembered threat. Something that happens to liars, criminals, and more often than not, women. Especially women who accuse men. Because in a world where a woman's word is worth less than a man's, divine intervention becomes the only judge. God, they say, will protect the innocent. You just have to suffer a little first. This particular ordeal is called ordeal by hot iron. You're to carry a searing iron bar for a set number of paces, then your hand will be bound and left for 3 days. If the wound festers, you lied. If it heals cleanly, you told the truth. Simple, right? Unless you consider that most wounds do fester when inflicted in the open air by a red-hot rod and wrapped in medieval linen. But never mind that. They say justice is blind, but here it's just deaf to your scream. These ordeals weren't universal across Europe, but where they did exist, they were disproportionately used on the poor and the powerless. A noble woman could sometimes escape with a carefully worded letter or a family favour. A peasant woman, she had to prove her pain was righteous, not just experienced, but divinely verified. It wasn't always fire. Sometimes it was boiling water. Reach in and retrieve a stone from the bottom of a cauldron. If your skin didn't blister too badly, God had spoken. Other times it was the cold ordeal. You'd be tied up and thrown into a river. If you floated, you were guilty because water rejects evil. If you sank, you were innocent. Drowning was apparently a small price to pay for exoneration. There are even accounts of ordeals for rape cases, when no other evidence could be produced. A woman would undergo trial to prove she was telling the truth about her assault. Never mind that she'd already been violated. Now she had to be hurt again to prove it. Some clerics argued against these trials, noting how cruel they were. Others defended them as tests of divine will. Either way, the victims were often left scarred, physically, socially, and spiritually. And these trials didn't happen in secret. They were public. That was the point. Shame was part of the ritual. The community watched as your dignity was stripped away, replaced with heat, blood, and the vague promise of validation. People remembered not the verdict, but the sight. A woman wincing in the cold, biting her lip to keep from screaming, watching her future melt away with the skin on her hands. And the irony? Even if the ordeal cleared you, that didn't guarantee safety. You might still be labelled troubled. You might still be whispered about in markets, avoided by suitors, pitied by neighbours. A woman who accused a man of rape and then passed an ordeal? Suspicious. What woman wants that kind of attention unless she's hiding something? The fear of these trials became another tool of silence. You learn not to speak, not to accuse, not unless you're ready to bleed for the privilege of being believed. And even then, belief is conditional. It has to be signed off by God himself. or at least by the men who claimed to interpret his will. The church didn't invent trial by ordeal, but it didn't rush to stop it either. In many cases, clerics officiated, blessing the tools of judgment and declaring the outcome divine. Only in the 13th century did the church formally ban clergy from participating, and even then, it took time for the practice to fade. In some places, it lasted well into the 14th century. By then, it had already shaped generations of fear. You remember hearing about a girl from a nearby village, accused of seducing a married man. She swore he came to her, not the other way around. She begged the bishop's court for mercy. They gave her a choice, public penance or ordeal. She chose the iron. Her hand never healed. She died from infection a week later. The man returned to his wife. No punishment, no shame, just another name erased from the record. And so here you are now, standing at the edge of the courtyard, staring at the glowing metal and knowing what's coming. You wonder if God will protect you, or if he's busy elsewhere, watching crusades or cloistered monks copying verses that ignore women like you. You wonder if anyone in the crowd actually cares, if they believe you, or if they're just here for the spectacle. Here's your historical fact. Trial by ordeal was a common judicial practice in parts of medieval Europe, often used in cases with little evidence, including rape, and disproportionately inflicted on women, especially those without social standing. Your fringe fact? Some trial rituals included holy water blessed with relics or saints' bones, as if divine proximity might improve the odds of a clean wound. In one case, a woman accused of adultery had to carry a cross in her mouth while walking barefoot across hot ploughshares, because nothing says piety like mouth splinters and third-degree burns, and your scholarly debate. Some historians argue that ordeals gave women some chance to be believed when other systems denied them completely, if they survived. Others see them as state-sanctioned torture disguised as religious justice, reinforcing patriarchal control under the guise of divine intervention. So you take the iron, you walk the required steps, you keep your eyes forward, refusing to cry. You know the pain will come, you know the scar will stay, but for once at least you get to hold the weapon, even if only for a moment. You sit quietly on the edge of a straw-stuffed pallet, staring at the sliver of moonlight coming through the shuttered window. Your hands cradle your belly, not in joy, not in anticipation, but in dread. You didn't ask for this, you didn't choose this, but now your body is growing evidence of something you couldn't stop. The women in your village whisper when they see you. Some look at you with pity, others with suspicion, because in the Middle Ages, a pregnant woman without a husband, or worse, with a husband she's accused of resisting, is a scandal, a sermon, and a legal argument all rolled into one. And the worst part? Your pregnancy means the law probably doesn't believe you were raped, because here's how the logic went. If you got pregnant, then you must have consented. If your body accepted a child, then clearly you welcomed the act that made it. Twisted, right? But this wasn't some fringe belief held by the ignorant few. It was enshrined in theology, in legal doctrine, even in court records. Men who forced themselves on women, whether strangers, neighbours or husbands, could point to pregnancy as their get-out-of-hell-free card. How could it be rape, they'd ask you, if she conceived? And judges, clerics, scribes, they nodded. Because medieval medicine and theology taught that conception required female pleasure. The woman's body, it was believed, had to actively participate in order to become pregnant. The idea that trauma could result in a child was not just rejected, it was considered impossible. So if your belly began to swell after the attack, the sympathy disappeared. The system reclassified you, not as a victim, but as an adulteress, a liar, or just another sinful woman who regretted what she'd done. The science, of course, was garbage, but it sounded logical enough when cloaked in Latin and delivered from the lips of scholars with cathedral-shaped hats. Thinkers like Galen and Aristotle, whose theories had been stretched thin over centuries, believed that female seed was needed alongside the male's for pregnancy to occur, that both parties had to achieve climax, that a woman's womb would not open without her arousal. So if a child was conceived, then she must have desired it. She must have wanted it. Even if she cried, even if she bled, even if she begged him to stop. And if you claimed you were raped and then became pregnant by someone who wasn't your husband, the implications were disastrous. You might be disbelieved entirely, or worse, punished. There were cases where women were flogged, fined, or exiled, not for the rape, but for adultery. The church might demand penance, The local lord might demand silence. Your family might demand you disappear until the baby came. If it lived, it might be taken from you. If it died, people might accuse you of murder. Either way, the child becomes a curse, breathing proof of your supposed sin, or the only thing worse, not being believed at all. Because in some cases, your rapist could claim you seduced him. He might say you led him on, that you were seen speaking with him, that you walked near his cottage alone. And if you're carrying his child, well, what more proof does anyone need that you invited him in? Courts use this kind of circular logic all the time. The pregnancy itself proved you were complicit. It became both cause and effect, accusation and verdict. Even midwives, the few women with any medical knowledge, couldn't always help. They were often bound by the same superstitions and church oversight. Some might believe you, some might even comfort you quietly in whispers, but publicly they had to follow the rules. They might be asked to testify about whether you seemed willing based on the condition of your body. A bruised woman with a child inside her could be interpreted as both sinner and liar. One midwife's statement could make or break your case, not against your attacker, but against you. And let's not even touch on the theology. You're pregnant, alone, maybe injured. You go to the priest, hoping for some shred of spiritual comfort, and what does he say? Repent. He might ask what you did to provoke the man. He might remind you that even Mary suffered, and she bore her child in purity and silence. But you are no Virgin Mary. You are mortal, bruised, and now responsible for a life created from violence. You wonder whether to keep the child, whether you'll be allowed to, whether your family will hide you until the baby comes, or cast you out entirely, whether the villagers will help you or treat you like you're contagious. Because in this world, being a woman who says no and then ends up pregnant isn't just unlucky, it's a scandal, a paradox, a theological puzzle no one wants to solve. Even within marriage, the story doesn't get better. If you're pregnant by your husband after weeks, months, or years of him forcing himself on you, what protection does that offer? None. If anything, it reinforces the idea that everything is fine, that you're fertile, that the marriage is productive, that you're fulfilling your role. Any whisper of abuse is drowned out by the heartbeat of the child inside you. And if you miscarry, the suspicion grows again. Was it an accident? Or did you try to end it? Women who lost babies under unclear circumstances could be accused of witchcraft, of infanticide, of using herbs and female knowledge to defy God's will. Some were dragged before ecclesiastical courts. Others were punished by family or left to rot in their own shame. Because in a world where pregnancy is always your fault, whether you want it or not, there's no version of the story where you come out clean. Here's your historical fact. Medieval courts and clerical doctrine often treated pregnancy as evidence that a woman had consented to sex, even in rape cases, based on the widespread but false belief that conception required female pleasure. Your fringe fact, one 13th century legal manual argued that if a woman became pregnant from rape, she should be punished for fornication unless she could prove she had physically resisted to the utmost. Proof in this case might mean bruises, blood, or broken bones. Emotional trauma didn't count. In your scholarly debate? Some researchers suggest that early medieval medical texts allowed more nuance, acknowledging that forced conception was possible, but that over time legal systems hardened around a narrower, moralistic interpretation. Others argue the idea of pregnancy as proof of consent was always more about control than science. So you sit with your hands cradling the quiet lump of life inside you, and you ask yourself a question you never imagined needing to ask. Can something growing in you also be a verdict? Because here, now, the answer is yes. You walk into the feast hall, past wooden tables groaning under roasted meats and tankards of ale, where the minstrels have already begun to sing. Laughter spills from the lips of knights and merchants, the air thick with the clatter of goblets and the heavy scent of smoke and sweat. Someone nudges you toward the corner where the performers are gathering, lutes being tuned, drums thumped into rhythm. And then you hear it. The lyric starts slow, dramatic. A knight spots a maiden in the woods. She resists, so he pursues. She says no. He persists. Eventually, of course, she relents, and the crowd erupts with laughter and applause, because in this song, like so many others, no doesn't mean no, it means try. This right here is the culture of consent, or lack thereof in medieval entertainment. You thought you were just going to hear a silly ballad. Maybe catch a break from your long day of spinning or washing, or pretending not to be terrified of your own husband. But the stories you hear in the music and see in the tapestries reinforce what the church, the courts, and your neighbours already believe. A woman's no is not a stop sign. It's a prelude, a challenge, a romantic obstacle the hero must overcome. You see it everywhere once you notice. In love songs and chivalric poetry, in the tales of King Arthur and his knights, in the troubadour verses from Provence, even in the sweet-faced illuminated manuscripts where some cloaked figure is grabbing a veiled woman by the wrist. These aren't warnings, they're fantasies. They tell of women who say no until they say yes, and men who press onward with boldness and valour and desire. That's what it's called, desire. Not aggression, not coercion, and certainly not rape. Take the romance of Tristan and Isolde. In many versions, Isolde drinks a love potion, essentially a medieval aphrodisiac, after which she falls for Tristan. But the potion removes consent from the equation. She doesn't choose him, she is enchanted into submission. But the story treats this as tragic romance, not a moral dilemma. The audience sighs over their doomed love, not the fact that her agency was stolen by a sip of wine and magic. Or look at the Roman de la Rose, one of the most influential literary works of the Middle Ages. It's an allegorical poem about a man trying to pluck a symbolic rose, representing a woman's chastity. The entire poem is a drawn-out metaphor for seduction. At the end, the rose is taken, not given, by force, and the act is celebrated as poetic triumph. Not assault, triumph. And it's not just poetry. Art joins in too. Tapestries and manuscript illuminations often depict so-called romantic scenes that today read as deeply troubling. Women being chased, pinned, or tricked by men, their resistance exaggerated with fluttering hands and averted eyes. One recurring image is the Siege of the Castle of Love, where knights literally storm a symbolic female fortress with flowers and ladders. It's all meant to be playful, symbolic. Unless, of course, you live in a world where castles are real, and women are actually being cornered and claimed without their consent. You try to laugh along at the song, to pretend that you're amused. Because what else can you do? No one in the room sees the problem. The bride at the high table smiles awkwardly as the lyrics hit closer to home. She's probably 15, newly married, still flinching when her new husband reaches for her. But the song says this is love. That resistance is part of the game. That the chase is what makes it exciting. You keep your smile frozen, your stomach curling inward. The problem with these stories isn't just that they exist. It's that they're everywhere. They create a cultural script that says women are gatekeepers, not participants. That saying no is an invitation, not a boundary. That men earn love through persistence, especially sexual persistence. And because these stories are wrapped in art and song, they feel charming, harmless. You find yourself humming them as you sweep the floor, not realizing the lyrics you've memorized are the same ones used to justify your silence. And of course the church rarely objected. As long as the songs didn't openly mock clergy or doctrine, they were tolerated. Some even found their way into religious commentary, twisted into allegories about the soul and salvation. You could write about a knight seducing a maiden and still be welcomed in court or cloister, so long as you cloaked it in courtly love. The term itself, finamore, was supposed to mean refined spiritual affection, but in practice it often meant manipulation dressed in rhyme. Women occasionally wrote back. A few female poets in the courts of southern France, Trebizhitz, composed songs that challenged these narratives. They sang of women who refused, who didn't fall in love, who were angry. Their verses didn't last as long, they weren't copied as often, but they were there. Brief flares of resistance in a genre that otherwise silenced women by singing over them. Here's your historical fact. Much of medieval literature and art romanticised coercion and framed female resistance as part of the courtship process, reinforcing a cultural norm that normalised male persistence and minimised the idea of female sexual autonomy. Your fringe fact? In one particularly odd example, a medieval manuscript includes a joke tale about a knight who tricks a maiden into sex by dressing as her fiancée, then brags about it. The scribe who copied the story into the margin added a doodle of a grinning dog, because even scribes found rape hilarious, apparently. And your scholarly debate? Some argue that these stories were not meant to be prescriptive, that they reflect fantasy, not reality. Others insist that fantasy shapes reality, and that these works played a key role in training generations to view female resistance as performative rather than genuine. So you sit at the edge of the hall, hands in your lap, as another song begins, this time about a clever shepherdess and the nobleman who won't take no for an answer. It ends, predictably, with happily ever after. You sip your watered wine and think about how many of these stories started with a woman screaming and ended with the world pretending she never did. You're alone in the house now. The hearth is cold, the doors are latched, and for the first time in your adult life, no one expects you to undress for them. Your husband is dead, buried just a week ago, under heavy stone and heavier prayers. The neighbours came with their baskets of bread and poorly hidden smirks. Some cried. You didn't. You sat quietly at the front of the funeral mass, hands folded, face still. No one knows what goes through your mind because no one asks. You're a widow now, and for a flickering moment that feels like freedom. But the Middle Ages doesn't really let women be free. Even death, his death, doesn't untangle you from the web of expectations. You're still a woman, which means you're still property. And now that your husband is gone, everyone's wondering who gets to claim you next. Because the legal and social status of widows is a strange in-between. Not quite married, not quite independent. You're a woman alone, and in this world, that's a threat. At first, they call you respectable. You wear black, you fast, you lower your gaze. You perform grief like a ritual, because even your mourning must follow rules. Too much sorrow, and people think you're hysterical. Too little, and then they whisper that maybe you're relieved. Maybe you helped him along. After all, it's not like anyone saw you cry. But behind the veils and hushed prayers is a waiting game. You might have inherited land, dowry, livestock, even a house. And that makes you valuable, not as a person, but as an asset. The same men who barely looked at you while your husband was alive now send gifts. Apples, candles, notes you can't read but instinctively mistrust. You've gone from someone's possession to a piece of property up for reevaluation, and God help you if you don't remarry quickly enough, or if you say you don't want to. Because not wanting to remarry is suspicious, it's unnatural. A woman living alone, managing her own estate, making her own decisions, that's not pious, that's dangerous. It threatens the fragile structure of patriarchy, and people begin to notice. The priest starts bringing up your future. Neighbours joke loudly about eligible men. Even your own family pressures you. You can't manage this farm on your own, they say. It's too much for one woman. But you hear what they're really saying. Your time as an individual is temporary. Legally, your position is precarious. In some regions, widows can retain control of their dowries or dower lands, sections of their late husband's property meant to support them. But that depends on the local lord, the church, and whether your husband made the proper arrangements before dying. If he didn't, you could lose everything. A brother-in-law might show up with a claim, or the manor court might simply reassign the tenancy, assuming you can't hold it. And if you had no children, or worse, only daughters, you're even more vulnerable. Male relatives are always lurking in the margins. You think about hiding the key, about claiming the well is dry, about pretending the goats are ill-tempered, just to scare suitors off. But they keep coming, wrapped in armour or scripture or flattery, each one saying the same thing without saying it. Your body still belongs to someone. Let it be me. Some women remarry quickly, either by choice or force. Others resist. A few become known as merry widows, though the label is less charming than it sounds. It's a way to call you licentious without using the word. If you laugh too loudly or walk without a chaperone, people start talking. If you're seen with a man, any man, you're accused of lechery. Because being single and sexually unavailable doesn't compute in this world. You're either a wife or a whore. There's no checkbox for neither. And here's the darker edge. Some widows become targets. Without a husband to protect them, they're vulnerable to abuse. Not just whispers and proposals, but actual violence, assault, rape. And if it happens, it's seen as their own fault for being unguarded. What did she expect living alone like that, the villagers mutter. You become cautionary folklore before your body even heals. Of course, a few manage to thrive. Wealthy widows sometimes buy their way into autonomy, using their dowries to support businesses, manage land, even fund religious projects. Abbesses are often drawn from the ranks of widows, women too old or too experienced to remarry, who instead rise through ecclesiastical ranks. They become respected, feared even, but only because they trade their sexuality for authority. They become desexualized in the public eye, saintly mothers, not tempting women. You're not an abbess, you're just trying to keep the roof patched and the accounts balanced. And while some of that feels empowering, waking without fear, sleeping without expectation, you also know it can't last. The eyes are always on you, the pressure builds with each passing season. Winter will come, and with it, another round of questions. Still alone? No offers? How long do you plan to mourn? Here's your historical fact. Widows in the Middle Ages held a complicated legal status. They could sometimes own property and exert independence, but social and religious pressures often pushed them back into marriage or cloistered life. Your fringe fact. In some medieval towns, widows were required to wear special garments or veils for a set mourning period, usually a year, after which they were eligible again, like a dress being returned to the market rack. And your scholarly debate? Some historians argue that widowhood was the most autonomous phase a woman could experience in medieval Europe, while others stress that such autonomy was limited, conditional, and often short-lived, especially outside the elite classes. So you bank the fire, draw the shutters, and settle into the quiet of your widow's bed. No footsteps in the hall tonight, no hands reaching. For now, your body is yours, and even if the world won't allow it forever, tonight is enough. You sit at the edge of your widow's bed, your black mourning veil now folded away in a chest that smells of cedar and dust. The neighbours no longer speak in hushed tones when you pass, though the curiosity hasn't faded. You've done what many widows must do once the acceptable grieving period ends. You've made a choice, or rather, you've been pushed into one. You could remarry. You could enter a convent. Either way, your body will no longer belong to you. That brief, fragile season of autonomy is over. You're back on the auction block, whether draped in lace or cloaked in linen. It's never really your choice, of course. Not fully. If you're young and fertile, the pressure to remarry comes swiftly. Lords want your land paired with a loyal man. Families want your womb put to use again. Even the church, which pretends to value celibacy, tends to look favourably on women returning to the natural order of wifely obedience. Remarriage is framed as both practical and moral. It keeps society tidy, it keeps you protected. Whoa. But you know what it really means? It means starting all over again. Another husband, another household, another man with the right to touch you without asking. And if you refuse, if you say no thank you to all the suitors, the elders start whispering about your spiritual state. She's not meant for the world anymore, they say. She should give her life to God. That sounds noble, almost poetic, but what they're really saying is, put her somewhere she can't cause problems, somewhere out of reach, somewhere quiet, so they nudge you toward the cloister. Maybe it's your late husband's family who funds it. Maybe it's your brother who arranges the donation to the abbey. You're told it's an honour to become a bride of Christ, to wear the habit, to pray away the remaining years of your life. But you know better. This isn't elevation. It's containment. It's another set of walls. Women entering convents as widows didn't always arrive by choice. Some came because they were shamed out of remarriage. Others were pressured by relatives who wanted to redirect their inheritance. In some cases, a widow might even be accused of promiscuity or scandal if she lingered too long without taking a vow. The church liked to pretend the cloister was voluntary, but behind every pious retreat was often a story of social manoeuvring and economic concern, and once inside, your body is still not your own. You belong to God now, but God has delegates, abbesses, confessors, bishops. You're told when to wake, when to eat, when to fast. You cover your hair. You sleep in a communal dormitory. You follow the rule, which varies depending on the order, but almost always emphasizes silence, submission, and the mortification of flesh. If you are hoping for peace, you get ritual. If you are hoping for escape, you get structure. You leave one man's bed for another's metaphorical embrace. Not that remarriage is any better. If you choose, or are pressured, to remarry, your new husband is under no obligation to respect your past. Some men treat widows with suspicion, as if previous experience makes you cunning or impure. Others treat you like a warm body with useful skills. You already know how to run a household, to manage servants, to bear children. You're an efficient acquisition, not a new partner. And you already understand what's expected in the bedroom, but perhaps that's why he picked you. There's no honeymoon period, no second chance romance, just a return to duties you never chose the first time around. You go from being a woman alone to a woman absorbed. Again. Maybe he's gentler than the first. Maybe not, but that's not really the point. The point is that your moment of agency has passed. You're no longer a widow, you're back in a role the world recognises, obedient wife or devout nun. The two faces of post-marital womanhood, and heaven help the woman who tries to avoid both. Some did, of course. There are scattered records of widows who refused to remarry and refused the cloister, who lived with sisters or managed family estates. Some paid off their lords for the right to live independently. A few succeeded, most didn't. Without the protection of a man or the enclosure of a convent, a woman was vulnerable to accusations of immorality, witchcraft, or seduction. A widow walking alone through a market was considered suspicious. A widow living alone in the woods, practically a witch. Even literature made examples of them. The merry widow trope, playful on the surface, was usually a warning. She was cunning, dangerous, possibly lustful. She disrupted the order of things. The good widow mourned properly and then remarried, or she disappeared into God's arms. The bad widow laughed too loud, stayed unmarried too long, and ended up cursed or punished. Or both. You think about all this as you sign the document, whether it's your wedding contract or your convent vow. You dip the quill into ink, scratch your name, and feel the weight of the decision. Not because it's what you want, but because it's the path of least resistance. Because standing still in this world gets you dragged. Because the only thing more frightening than giving your body away again is what happens if you try to keep it. Here's your historical fact. In medieval Europe, widows were often expected to remarry quickly or enter a convent, both paths representing continued male or institutional control over their lives and bodies. Your fringe fact? Some abbeys had quotas for how many noble-born widows they could accept based on space, dowry size, and political influence. In some cases, a wealthy widow could essentially buy her way into a position of respect, while poorer ones were turned away or pressured into remarriage instead. And your scholarly debate? Some historians argue that widowhood offered rare opportunities for autonomy, while others emphasise how limited those choices really were, framed as freedom only when women continued to behave within acceptable social and moral boundaries. So now you stand at the threshold of your next role, veil or ring in hand, and you feel the walls close in again. Different walls perhaps, a softer lock, but a lock all the same. You stand in the doorway of a tavern, the heat of the hearth washing over your face, your fingers still aching from the cold outside. Behind you, the streets of the city bustle with the noise of carts, dogs, drunken laughter, and the occasional cry of a night watchman. But inside the mood is warmer, heavier, wrapped in the thick aroma of ale, sweat, meat, and 100 conversations. This isn't the world of noble courts or monastic halls. This is the city, a place where everything's for sale, including the illusion of freedom. And for urban women in the Middle Ages, this is where the rules shift. Not vanish, just bend. You're not a noble woman, you're not a peasant tethered to a plot of land. You're part of a growing, chaotic city. Maybe you work here, pouring ale into mugs and managing the unruly laughter of men who see you as both servant and spectacle. Or maybe you work in a bathhouse down the road, one of the many places where labour and sex often blend into something much murkier than choice. In the city, women can earn their own coin, sometimes even good coin, but there's always a price, and that price often involves the erosion of boundaries others get to call sacred. Taverns and bathhouses were some of the few places women could work outside the domestic sphere, and yes, that meant money, autonomy, sometimes even a room of your own. But it also meant you were suddenly part of the sex economy, whether or not you intended to be. A serving girl might be groped under the table, propositioned before noon, or offered double pay for private service. And the worst part, most of the time she couldn't say no, not if she wanted to keep her job, not if the man was important, not if the landlord got a cut of the extras. Bathhouse workers dealt with even less pretense. On paper, bathhouses were places for hygiene and health, hot water, massages, grooming. In practice, they often served as semi-legal brothels. Some had codes of conduct, sure, some even operated under licenses, but everyone knew what was happening behind the steamy curtains. And the women working there weren't just attendants, they were objects of speculation, desire, and gossip. They were also, all too often, targets. And yet, in a strange way, these women had more control than many of their rural or noble counterparts. They could earn wages, refuse certain clients, form alliances with other women. They weren't owned by husbands or locked away by lords, but this freedom came with constant risk. If you said no to the wrong man, you could be beaten, fired, even arrested. If you were too successful, you could be accused of sorcery, promiscuity, or corrupting others. The The city wanted your labour, your smile, your body, but not your voice. Even the laws of the city treated women's sexuality like a resource to be managed. Urban statutes often made distinctions between honest women and public women. If you were caught walking alone at night, you might be assumed to be a prostitute, regardless of your actual profession. In some cities, women who dressed too finely could be fined or even jailed, under the assumption that their wealth came from immoral work. A woman with autonomy was always a little too suspicious for comfort. Still, the city offered opportunities that didn't exist elsewhere. Some women rose to manage taverns, brothels, or bathhouses themselves. A few even became quite wealthy. Urban records mention female entrepreneurs, brewsters, weavers, apothecaries, some of whom employed men. That didn't make them immune to harassment, of course. It just meant they could afford locks on their doors and silence their enemies with coin. Power in this world came through coin more than title, and that made city women dangerous in a way country girls and noble ladies rarely could be. But the danger cut both ways. Many of these women had no protection. They weren't under the legal care of a father or husband. If they were attacked, they often had no one to advocate for them. And even when they did report violence, the courts rarely favoured them. An unmarried woman working in a bathhouse or tavern was often seen as fair game. She put herself in that position, the logic went. She invited it. Consent, once again, was a word no one cared to define, especially when a woman stood outside the acceptable categories of wife, widow, or nun. Church officials often railed against these establishments, calling them dens of sin. But they rarely shut them down. Why? Because the demand never stopped. Because even the priests and merchants who condemned them by day visited by night. Because the city ran on hypocrisy, and women's bodies were part of the economy. And for every sermon condemning sexual immorality, there was a payment quietly made for silence or satisfaction. Here's your historical fact. Urban centres in the medieval period offered women employment in taverns, bathhouses, and service industries. But these roles came with increased vulnerability to exploitation and social stigma, especially around issues of sexual consent. Your fringe fact. In parts of medieval Paris, bathhouse workers were required by city statute to wear certain coloured belts or sashes during work hours, making their roles visible and, in effect, branding them as sexually accessible whether or not they consented. And your scholarly debate? Some historians see medieval urban women as early agents of economic autonomy, navigating complex roles in patriarchal spaces. Others argue this autonomy was superficial, circumscribed by violence, moral judgment, and the ever-present risk of being reclassified as a fallen woman. So you glance around the firelit room, the laughter louder now, the wine flowing freely. You pour another cup, sidestep a hand at your waist, and remind yourself that in this city, you walk a razor's edge, and though you've earned the right to say no, you know better than to say it too loudly. You wake before dawn, pressing your feet to the chilled floorboards of your rented chamber. It's not much, just a cot, a basin, and a cracked window that looks out over the fishmonger's alley. But it's yours. You make your way down the narrow stairs, past the creaking signboard that reads Maison de Fleurs, though no one's here for flowers. You're one of many women working here, some younger, some older, some who came by desperation, others by calculation. You dress quickly, your mind already calculating the coins you need by week's end, because yes, you're a prostitute. But what does that mean in this city? And more importantly, what rights, if any, does that give you over your own body? You'd think the answer would be none. After all, prostitution in the Middle Ages was tangled up in every kind of moral contradiction, legal ambiguity, and double standard imaginable. But here's the strange thing. In many cities, prostitutes were legally recognised, regulated, expected, even taxed. In some regions, brothels were operated under municipal oversight. In others, they were watched closely by the church, not to abolish them, mind you, but to keep them contained. The logic was simple, crude, and male. Prostitution existed to protect good women to good men by giving bad men an outlet. Your body was considered a sponge for sin, a public service. You had rules to follow, though. Brothel women were often forbidden from dressing like honest wives. You wore yellow hoods, striped sashes, or special badges, so no one could mistake you for someone respectable. You couldn't go to church at certain hours. You had to live in designated quarters of the city, usually near the docks or the city gates, where your clientele could come and go discreetly. If a man assaulted you, your status as a prostitute worked against you. She sells herself, they'd say. She can't be raped, only bought. And that's where the lie cracks open. Even in a world that legally recognises prostitution, there's no real understanding of consent. The idea that you could agree to sex sometimes but still say no at other times? Foreign. If you worked in a brothel or offered services independently, people assumed you were always available. If a man paid your madam and you refused, that wasn't seen as a boundary. That was seen as fraud. If a customer grew violent and forced you, many courts wouldn't see it as a crime. You were a commodity, not a person, and the law doesn't punish men for breaking their toys. And yet paradoxically, this legal status offered some women small slivers of control, tiny windows of manoeuvring in an otherwise brutal economy. In certain cities, prostitutes formed unofficial guilds. They had elected leaders, communal rules, and sometimes even rudimentary health checks. A few managed their own establishments, hiring other women and negotiating with city officials directly. Some brothels had codes of conduct posted on their walls dictating how men should behave, how women should be treated, and what happened when lines were crossed. But enforcement, that was rare, and punishments, minimal. The power balance never truly tilted in your favour. The church's relationship with your profession was, predictably, soaked in contradiction. On the one hand, bishops and monks railed against the filth of fornication. On the other, they acknowledged the necessity of brothels to protect virgins, wives, and nuns. Theologians referred to you as a necessary evil. Even St. Thomas Aquinas compared prostitutes to sewer systems, disgusting, yes, but vital to keep society clean. If that metaphor makes your skin crawl, you're not alone. Confessors might hear your sins, then visit your workplace later under the cover of night. Clerics who patronised prostitutes were often gently reprimanded, while women caught servicing them could be whipped, branded, or forced to do public penance. It wasn't about morality, it was about appearance. Maintaining the illusion that the city's sin was managed, contained, civilised. Some women did find a way out. A wealthy client might redeem you, either by marrying you or funding your exit. Others saved enough coin to buy a stall in the market or a room of their own. A few retired into convents, though this required connections and often some performance of repentance. You had to cry at the right moment, invoke the Virgin Mary and swear you were ready to live without temptation. And by temptation they meant freedom, but many didn't escape. You grew older, less desirable, and eventually faded into the back rooms, teaching younger girls how to deal with the drunken soldiers and how to fake a smile through the pain. Some died young, others were buried with no marker. A few were dumped in plague pits during the outbreaks, unnamed and unmourned, because even in death, prostitutes were considered unworthy of sacred burial. And yet, in these narrow alleyways and shuttered windows, there was solidarity. The women around you weren't saints or sinners, they were survivors. You shared food, you shared tips on avoiding bruises, you shared silence. Because the only people who truly understood your life were the ones living it beside you. Here's your historical fact. In many medieval European cities, prostitution was legal and regulated by local authorities. But this did not protect sex workers from violence or grant them any real autonomy over their bodies. Your fringe fact. In 15th century Nuremberg, brothels had operating hours posted by the city council. They even closed on major feast days, because apparently Jesus needed a break from institutional hypocrisy too, and your scholarly debate. Some argue that legalised prostitution gave medieval women rare economic power in a rigidly patriarchal society. Others counter that this power was illusory, conditional on youth, beauty and obedience, and that most women in the trade were trapped by poverty and violence with no real way out. So you pour water over your face, tie your sash, and step back into the front room, where the lamps have just been lit and footsteps echo up the stairs. The rules here say you're allowed to choose, but you've learned what that really means. They get to ask, and you're expected to say yes, every time you tighten the bindings across your chest. The linen wrapping flattening your shape, disguising the curves that have betrayed you for too long. You pull your cloak tighter, shift your hood forward, and stare into the mirror. Not the polished silver of a noble lady, but the warped, cloudy metal shard you've stashed in the bottom of your travel sack. You look again, you're almost there, with your hair cropped short and your tunic cinched just so, you pass, not entirely as a man, but close enough to move unnoticed. In this moment, you're no longer a wife, a widow, or a girl destined for the convent. You're someone else, and for the first time in your life you feel something dangerously close to freedom. There's a strange recurring figure that pops up in the margins of medieval history. The woman who vanishes, then reappears dressed as a man. Sometimes she joins a monastery, sometimes she takes to the road, sometimes she becomes a scribe, a soldier, even a scholar. Her name changes, her voice lowers, her hips disappear beneath layers of cloth. And for a little while the world stops treating her like an object, because for a little while she isn't a woman at all. These weren't common stories, but they weren't myths either. There are real cases of women who cross-dress to escape marriage, to avoid assault, to enter professions closed to them. Some were caught and punished, others were celebrated, oddly enough, after their deaths. Once it was safe to admire their bravery without having to deal with their defiance. In a strange twist, some were even sainted, because the only thing more admirable than a woman who obeyed the rules was a woman who broke them for God. Take St. Marina of Bithynia. Born in the 8th century, she disguised herself as a man to enter a monastery with her father. She lived as a monk for years, enduring suspicion, false accusations, even exile. When she died, her identity was revealed, and the other monks were shocked and supposedly humbled. Suddenly, her suffering was holy. Her disguise became devotion, or Joan of Arc, who wore men's clothing and armour while leading troops into battle. She cut her hair, took command, refused marriage, and claimed her orders came directly from God. The church condemned her, not for her prophecies, but for her clothing. Heresy was debatable. Cross-dressing was unforgivable. They burned her at the stake. Later, they canonized her, but not before punishing her for refusing to fit the role they'd written for her body. And then there were the less famous, the unnamed. The women who fled abusive husbands by disguising themselves as men and taking jobs on ships or in towns where no one asked too many questions. We know about them from arrest records, church denunciations, or the occasional scandalous confession. They weren't trying to make a point. They were just trying to survive in a world where being female made them vulnerable at every turn. It wasn't easy. Passing as male meant constant vigilance. No bathing in public, no letting your voice rise too high, no showing fear, especially around other men. You had to learn how to spit, how to fight, how to blend in. One wrong gesture, one unguarded laugh, and everything could collapse. If discovered, the punishment varied. You might be cast out, whipped, imprisoned, or forced into a convent under strict watch. In rare cases, you might be tried for heresy or perversion, because to assume the form of a man was seen as theft, of authority, of privilege, of divine order. And yet for some, the risk was worth it, because life as a woman offered no better odds. You could be raped, married off, beaten, or silenced, and no one would blink. But dress as a man? Suddenly you could walk alone at night. You could carry a knife and not be questioned. You could say no and be left alone, not because they respected your autonomy, but because they thought you had the power to retaliate. It was the costume of safety. Of course, not everyone who cross-dressed was fleeing abuse. Some wanted to study, to travel, to be. The medieval world had no space for gender variance as identity, at least not in ways that mirror modern terms, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist. Some records describe individuals who lived for decades in disguise, not out of emergency, but preference. These people weren't running from something. They were running towards something, a life that made more sense than the one they'd been assigned. And here's where it gets tricky. The church didn't have a single consistent stance on cross-dressing. Some theologians quoted Deuteronomy, "A woman shall not wear a man's garment." Others made exceptions for survival. If a woman wore male clothes to protect herself from assault, it was sometimes tolerated, though rarely praised. But the moment she took pride in it, claimed agency, or challenged male authority, the gloves came off. Or rather, the flames came out. You think about all this as you step out into the morning light, your boots crunching on frost. No one looks twice, no catcalls, no stares. Just a passerby, one among many. You feel your shoulders square without meaning to. You feel taller, not because the clothes have power, but because the absence of vulnerability is intoxicating. This, you think, is what men feel every day. Not just safety, possibility. Here's your historical fact. There are documented cases of medieval women who cross-dress to escape marriage, avoid assault, or enter male-only spaces like monasteries or universities, often risking severe punishment if discovered. Your fringe fact. In one 14th century case from Spain, a woman lived as a man for over a decade, working as a notary and marrying another woman. When exposed, she claimed she'd received divine permission to live as a man, an argument that almost worked. In your scholarly debate, some researchers argue that cross-dressing women in the Middle Ages should be seen as proto-feminist figures, while others caution against projecting modern identities onto individuals who likely had complex and context-specific reasons for their choices. So you pull your cloak tighter, step into the market square, and disappear into the crowd. You're not anyone's wife, not someone's daughter, not a holy bride or a public woman. You're just a shadow moving freely through the world, and for now, that's enough. You wake to shouting in the street, sharp, angry voices layered over the clatter of boots and the panicked yelping of dogs. You rise, still dressed from the night before, and slip to the window. Outside, people are running, not from a fire or a flood, but from her. A woman bound at the wrists, her hair wild, her gown torn, is being dragged by a group of men toward the church square. A priest leads them, swinging a censer like a weapon. You can already guess what they'll say she is. A whore, a temptress, a witch. Because those are the words they always reach for when a woman dares to exist outside their control. You've seen this before. Maybe not here, maybe not yet. But the story plays on a loop throughout the countryside and the cities alike. A woman who says no too often. A woman who owns too much. A woman who knows herbs or speaks her mind or is too beautiful or not beautiful enough. It doesn't take much. The medieval world has a sharp eye for inconvenient women and a long memory for invented sins. Today she's a witch. Last year it was another woman accused of bewitching a man's virility. Before that, a healer blamed for a stillbirth. And what do they all have in common? They said no at the wrong time, or simply weren't asked. The charges sound ridiculous, until you realise they don't have to make sense. No one needs proof that she danced with the devil, just the right mood in the town square, just a few well-timed whispers, a neighbour's grudge, a spurned suitor. Maybe she turned down a man in power. Maybe she resisted the wrong priest. Maybe she simply didn't beg enough. And once the accusation is out there, it sticks like pitch. Women labelled as witches are dragged into public, their bodies displayed as warnings. Interrogations follow, not polite, not legal in any meaningful way. Torture is common, they call it persuasion. Stretching racks, thumb screws, water dunking, and worst of all, sleep deprivation. Keep someone awake long enough and they'll confess to anything. They'll name lovers, spirits, demons, other women. The point isn't truth, the point is spectacle. And when these women break, when they've finally mumble the names they're asked to give, or admit to flying on broomsticks or seducing the local friar with herbs and moonlight, that's it, that's all they need. Because the accusation was never about witches, it was about power, about control, about finding a convenient reason to punish a woman for being inconvenient. Contrary to popular belief, the big witch-hunting hysteria really explodes after the medieval period, peaking in the 16th and 17th centuries. But the seeds are already planted here. By the late Middle Ages, demonology is becoming an obsession. Books like the Malleus Maleficarum, written in the late 1400s, begin to codify what makes a woman dangerous. Independence, sexuality, knowledge, beauty. But even before that infamous manual, there are records of women burned at the stake or drowned for little more than healing a sick child or growing the wrong plant in the wrong place. Herbalists are frequent targets, so are midwives. Women whose knowledge of the body, especially the female body, gives them a kind of soft power that threatens the clerics and physicians. These women know what to give a girl to ease her monthly pain, what to slip into a drink to prevent pregnancy, what leaves will bring on a miscarriage. To men, this knowledge is either diabolical or threatening, or both. Because if women can control their reproduction, what else might they claim? Even women who didn't deal in herbs weren't safe. Charismatic widows, spinsters, and loud-talking tavern keepers could all be accused of seducing men or bewitching children. Often, they were just women with no male guardians. That in itself was suspicious. The idea that a woman could survive without a husband, without a son, without a priest guiding her hand, that wasn't independence, it was rebellion. Her very existence questioned the whole fragile scaffolding of patriarchal order. And the punishments? Public and humiliating. Accused witches were paraded through towns, heads shaved, skin burned, sometimes tarred. If found guilty, they might be hanged, drowned, or burned. Though burning was more common on the continent than in England. The death wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. That was the point. A slow death sends a louder message. The church didn't always lead the charges, especially not early on. But by the 13th century, inquisitions begin to dip into local accusations of magic and heresy. Witchcraft becomes more than superstition. It becomes a theological crime, and as soon as theology enters the scene, everything gets more dangerous. Because now it's not just about jealousy or fear, it's about your soul. And once a woman is declared a danger to souls, no punishment is too extreme. You think again of the woman being dragged through the square. Maybe she was just too skilled at midwifery. Maybe she refused to sleep with the local reeve. Maybe she tried to live alone. Maybe she simply existed at the intersection of poverty and boldness. You wonder what she's thinking as the mob surrounds her. Maybe nothing. Maybe she's already gone somewhere else in her mind. Or maybe she's thinking the same thing you are, that no matter how well you behave, you're always one accusation away from the fire. Here's your historical fact. Accusations of witchcraft in the Middle Ages were often levied against women who challenged societal norms, especially healers, midwives, and those who lived outside male-dominated structures. Your fringe fact. In some regions, being left-handed was considered a potential sign of witchcraft. One 14th century record even lists a woman's preferred stirring hand as evidence during trial. So yes, cooking soup the wrong way could cost you your life, and your scholarly debate. While some scholars argue that witchcraft trials in the early medieval period were rare and often politically motivated, others believe they reflect deeper anxieties about female autonomy, sexuality, and the erosion of male spiritual authority. So you draw your curtains, snuff your candle, and return to bed. You tell yourself that as long as you stay quiet, stay small, stay useful, you'll be safe. But the truth lingers like smoke. Silence doesn't always save you. Sometimes it only delays the fire. You stand on the edge of a field at dusk, the air thick with smoke from the cooking fires and the last golden light pooling across the dirt road. The harvest is finished, and the villagers gather for one of the rare evenings of rest, laughter mixing with the clinking of jugs, the rustle of skirts, and the scratch of fiddles pulled from worn sacks. You used to love nights like these, when it almost felt like time stopped. But tonight, you watch from a distance, because you know how these gatherings end. There's food, dancing, too much drink, and then a girl goes missing, and tomorrow, no one will want to talk about it. They'll say she was drunk, that she shouldn't have stayed out so late, that she went willingly behind the grain barn, or maybe they won't say anything at all. Because for all the lightness and laughter, these festivals, like so many moments in medieval life, are full of shadows. And for young women, especially those without fathers or brothers nearby, they can be dangerous. You're reminded again that no matter how familiar a place feels, your safety is always conditional, always contingent on someone else's mood, drink, or desire. These village gatherings blur the lines between celebration and vulnerability. With ale flowing and roles temporarily relaxed, men feel bolder. They speak more freely, they laugh louder. They reach more easily. A compliment becomes a grab, a dance becomes a chase, and while some women play along, smiling, teasing, knowing how to navigate the social game, others find themselves cornered, because not every no is heard, especially when music's loud and someone else's reputation is already written for them. And here's the thing, the village doesn't really have a justice system for this. There's no police force to report to, no courtroom where testimony is weighed with impartiality. If something happens, if a girl is taken, hurt, violated, it's handled locally, quietly, often not at all. A priest might be consulted, but only if the girl is still respectable. If she's poor, if she's known for being flirtatious, or if the man is important, the response is likely to be penance. Or worse, blame. You've heard it all before. She was asking for it. She went with him willingly. She's done it before. And then, as if on cue, the social math begins. Her virtue is weighed like bread on a scale. Was she a virgin? Was she promised to someone? Was she pious? Did she pray often enough, wear the right clothes, keep her eyes down when walking past the mill? It doesn't matter what happened. What matters is whether her body was already owned by someone else, God, her family, or a future husband. If not, then she was expendable. The festival resumes the next day. Jokes are told, stories passed. No one names what happened. But the girl doesn't return to the next gathering. Or if she does, she stands alone. The other girls avoid her. The boys smirk when they pass. Maybe she's pregnant in a few months, and then everyone has something new to whisper about. No one ever asks her what really happened, not because they don't care, but because they're not sure they want to know. In small medieval communities, reputation is everything, and women's reputations are as fragile as eggshells. A single incident, even whispered, even false, can destroy a girl's chances at marriage, inheritance, even basic kindness from her neighbours. So mothers warn their daughters early. Don't walk alone, don't drink too much, don't smile too much, don't be too available, but also don't be cold. Don't refuse to dance. Don't draw attention by being strange or standoffish. Walk the razor's edge, they say. Be appealing but not easy. Be modest but not frigid. And always, always be ready to defend yourself, even though there's nothing you can say that will really make them believe you. You think about the old woman at the edge of the village. Giselle, they call her, though probably not her real name. She lives alone in a crumbling cottage and never comes to the festivals. She was once like you. Young, pretty, clever. People say she was ruined by a knight who passed through and left her with nothing but a baby and a bad reputation. She lost the child in winter, lost her voice not long after. Some say she went mad, others say she just got tired of not being believed. These kinds of stories are everywhere, though no one writes them down. They're passed in murmurs, in careful glances, in warnings mothers whisper to daughters while pretending they're just gossip. Don't end up like her, they say. She didn't know when to stop flirting. She let herself be seen too often. It's never about what was done to her. It's always about what she failed to prevent. As if the weight of every man's desire is a burden women are born trained to carry, and the men? They go on as usual. Maybe one gets quietly married to the girl he wronged. Maybe not. Maybe he leaves the village or joins a band of travelling merchants or becomes a priest. The village forgets his role, but the girl remains. She becomes a lesson, a warning, a shadowy. Here's your historical fact. In medieval rural communities, incidents of sexual violence were rarely prosecuted or even formally addressed unless the victim was of high status or the crime disrupted property lines or familial arrangements. Your fringe fact? In some villages, women could symbolically curse an attacker during public festivals by performing specific gestures with bread or flowers, part ritual, part protest. But these actions were often dismissed as superstition rather than justice. And your scholarly debate. Some historians argue that rural women had stronger community networks and informal ways to seek justice or protection, while others point out that tight-knit communities often prioritized male reputations and family alliances over women's safety. So you stay on the edge of the crowd, your back to the firelight, your eyes scanning the dancing bodies. You used to think these nights were magic. Now you know better. Magic is just another word for danger you haven't yet recognized. You sit by the fire, watching the flames lick the darkened walls, the only sound the crackle of burning wood and the soft breathing of the child asleep beside you. You think about your own mother, and her mother before her, and all the women whose stories were swallowed by time. Women who lived with the impossible weight of being seen but never truly heard, of their bodies being claimed over and over while their souls were tucked away in silence. You wonder what it means to exist in a world that so thoroughly denies your no, that weaponizes your obedience and turns your resistance into sin. But history isn't just about despair, it's also about resilience. You start to remember the ways women pushed back, small acts that didn't make it into the grand chronicles, but filled the corners of villages, courts, and convents with quiet rebellion. A peasant woman who faked illness to avoid her husband's advances, a noblewoman who refused to consummate her arranged marriage until a political dispute was settled, a group of women who formed a clandestine network sharing knowledge of herbs, prayers, and safe havens, a few who ran away, crossed borders, or disappeared into new identities. Resistance took many forms, but it was always dangerous, always fragile, and always necessary. You think of the nuns who documented daily life in their manuscripts, inserting hidden symbols of female solidarity amid prayers and psalms, of the wives who brought complaints to ecclesiastical courts, even knowing the odds were against them, of the women who risked everything by confessing their truth, praying that God, or maybe a sympathetic priest, would hear the silence beneath their words, of those who survived by learning to blend submission with cunning, transforming their roles into unexpected spaces of power. And you recall the scholars who centuries later began to uncover these hidden stories, reading between the lines, listening for the whispers erased by time. They debate, they argue, they reconstruct. Some say the Middle Ages was a time of unrelenting oppression. Others argue it was more complex, a world where women's voices were muted but never completely silenced, where agency was constrained but creativity and courage endured. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Your fingers trace the edges of a worn prayer book, its pages soft and thin. You imagine the hands that turned these pages, the women who prayed beneath these words. Their faith wasn't a chain, it was a lifeline. Even in a world that demanded silence, they found ways to speak, to themselves, to each other, to God. And in those moments, the power to say no flickered, however briefly, like a candle in a dark room. Here's your historical fact. Women in the Middle Ages employed subtle forms of resistance to the denial of sexual consent, including legal appeals, religious vows, social manoeuvring, and coded communication in religious texts. Your fringe fact. Some medieval convents developed secret signs and symbols in embroidery and illuminated manuscripts that functioned as messages of solidarity and shared suffering among women. And your scholarly debate? Historians continue to discuss whether these acts of resistance fundamentally challenged the patriarchal order or simply allowed women to navigate within its confines, making survival possible but change elusive. You lean back, watching the child breathe softly, and you realise that history isn't just about the past. It's about survival, about the persistence of the human spirit, about the quiet power of saying no when no one else will listen. You stand at the edge of the world, you know, the horizon stretching wide and wild beyond the walls of your village, your town, your life. The Middle Ages, the centuries of stone castles, cathedrals, plagues, and wars are behind you now, but their echoes linger in the way women's bodies have been controlled, silenced, and shaped by forces far larger than themselves. You think about all you've heard, all you've felt, the fear, the fury, the impossible choices, and the tiny acts of rebellion that refuse to be erased. You've walked through the shadows of a world where saying no was often the most dangerous word a woman could utter, and yet you've also seen the sparks that could ignite change. History, like life, isn't clean or simple, it's messy. It's full of contradictions. There were times when a woman's no was ignored, silenced, punished, but there were also times when it was whispered loud enough to be heard and even carried forward. Some women died to protect their bodies, their choices, their dignity. Others lived to teach their daughters to fight in quieter ways, to claim space within the limits imposed on them. And those limits, were they unbreakable? Not entirely. Every restriction contains a seam, every chain a weak link. The Middle Ages were long, vast, and diverse. Women lived vastly different lives depending on their class, geography, family, and sheer luck. Some had more room to maneuver than others, but all faced a world structured to control their sexuality and their consent. Yet in every corner the human desire for autonomy flickered. It demanded to be recognised. You think of the voices lost, the wives, the widows, the nuns, the servants, the prostitutes, the rebels, the saints. Their stories are fragments, scattered across dusty archives, whispered in legends, hidden in the margins of official texts. They remind you that history is not just the story of kings and battles, but of ordinary people surviving extraordinary oppression. Their struggles and their courage form the undercurrent of every era that followed. And here you are, in the present, holding this knowledge. What will you do with it? Remember, speak, fight. The past is never just behind you. It shapes the present and the future. Because the question of consent, the right to say no, is not just medieval. It's timeless, it's urgent. So you take a breath, steady and deep, and prepare to carry this story forward. Not as a whisper, not as a shadow, but as a clear, unyielding voice that honours the no's that came before and demands the no's to come. Here's your historical fact. The denial of women's consent in the Middle Ages was codified in law, theology and social custom, yet women found ways, both overt and subtle, to assert autonomy despite systemic oppression. Your fringe fact? Some medieval women disguised themselves as men, not just to escape abuse but to actively participate in politics, scholarship and warfare, challenging gender roles with each step. And your scholarly debate? Historians continue to explore how medieval women's resistance to sexual control shaped later feminist thought and how the legacy of medieval sexual norms influences modern perceptions of consent. Thank you for staying with me on this long, winding journey. I hope you found these stories as illuminating and humbling as I did telling them. If you liked what you heard, please do like and subscribe, only if it feels right, no pressure. And wherever you are right now, whatever time it is, I hope you can rest a little easier knowing these voices, once silenced, now speak through us. Now turn off the lights, pull your blanket close and let your mind drift, because sometimes understanding the past is the first step toward changing the future.